Every year, violent collisions kill 40,000 Americans and injure another 3 million. But there is no such thing as an accident. Every collision has a story as unique as the people involved. Rusty Haight's a leading authority on accident reconstruction. He trains investigators around the world to read the clues and solve the mysteries.
No two crashes are alike. Of the primary categories, frontal, rear end, rollover, and side impacts. These side impacts are the worst. They can lead to severe internal injuries and even fatalities for the person in that seat.
I'm going as fast as I can.
It's been another long evening at Grandma and Grandpa's for little Amy Rogers. After all, when you're only 2 years old, time can pass slowly, especially when Mommy and Daddy aren't happy. And they aren't happy. An argument over an upcoming move has left her parents at odds again. The young family leaves for home, tense, upset, and in a hurry.
Well, he's gonna have to wait like the rest of us, because...
At about the same time as the Rogers begin their drive home, two men several blocks away get in an SUV and head for home too. Far from having a stressful evening, though, they've been partying at a nearby bar.
That was fun, huh? That was a lot of fun.
In about 15 seconds, lives will be shattered. And it all could have been avoided if some basic safety rules had not been recklessly ignored.
Honey, sit down, okay?
No,
Let me fix the baby real quick.
yeah, take care of it. You've had a lot to drink.
At approximately 11 p.m. on a hot Arizona night, accident investigator John Heineman is called out to the crash scene.
How many victims again? 3 victims. The information I received from our desk sergeant, who got a hold of me that night, was that we had 2 vehicles involved, an SUV and a sedan. There was 3 victims.
It's a very bad one. The SUV is in the middle of the road. The car is on the curb, and a traffic light pole has been knocked down. Heineman believes one of these vehicles must have tried to run a red light. It's his job now to figure out exactly what happened and who, if anyone, was at fault.
When I got the call that there was 3 victims, immediately knew this was going to be a bad crash. Hey, Doug, Tom, hey, we got one.
Knowing that, Heineman asks his partner, Doug Kramer, to help him. The crash scene is a real calamity, even to a couple of policemen who've seen plenty of crashes. It's not the wreckage, as bad as that is. What strikes Heineman and Kramer is that there are bodies everywhere they look. Little Amy's parents are pronounced dead at the scene.
Yeah, again, no seatbelt here.
Both have suffered major head trauma and internal bleeding. In the SUV, passenger Peter O'Sullivan is also dead after smashing his head into the windshield and suffering 2 massive skull fractures. It appears the only survivor is the driver of the SUV, John Lowry. Looking at what is left of the SUV, Heineman is surprised to learn that Lowry suffered only minor injuries, not much more than a cut on his face. Apart from the physical evidence, Lowry is the only one who can talk about what happened. Everybody else is dead.
At the scene, we didn't have there was no independent witnesses to this collision, and we needed to know who ran the red light. That was a key for us. And went to the hospital, try and get some information out of the driver.
Before being transported to the hospital, Lowry tells investigators that it was the other car that ran the red light and hit him.
A crash at a traffic signal-controlled intersection suggests one of 2 things. First, it could be that the lights malfunctioned. That's usually unlikely. What's more likely is somebody ran the red light. The question is which car? For accident investigator John Heineman, he's going to have to apply his training and experience to sort out who actually ran that red light. At this point, one thing's for certain. He knows he has a side impact, and for occupants in a passenger car, that's the worst kind of crash to be in. On the front of a vehicle, we have all this distance, all this space we can crush. You've heard of crumple zones. Well, that's what's built into the front of a vehicle. You can't really make the side of a vehicle any wider. We're limited. And the best you can do, perhaps, is some side impact airbags. There's not much room here. If you're on the side and you're hit on the side, you're the first one at the point of impact.
So in a situation like this, where you have a passenger that's thrown all the way over to the driver's side, you can expect to see massive injuries to the head with the brain being jostled around, to the vertebral column, and to the internal organs, where they can be torn from their attachments. You can have severe internal bleeding.
As Heinemann and his team prepare to start gathering the physical evidence, they're informed of a disturbing new development.
They're at the scene. Fire captain approached us, told us they saw the back window had been broken, and there may be a fourth victim.
Through the broken windows of the couple's car, firefighters notice a child seat and some toys. Heinemann asks firefighters to search the surrounding area, hoping against hope that it wasn't the tiny body of a child that broke the back window. And then a scene that seemingly couldn't get any worse does. In the bushes, about 100 feet from the crash scene, firefighters find the lifeless body of 2-year-old Amy Rogers.
As a parent, having young kids, they're the worst, the absolute worst. When you find out that a young child, young life is gone, it really affects you. And you still got to put your emotions aside and do your investigation. But again, the kids are the worst. And the first things we noticed is that nobody was seatbelted in, and not even the infant. The infant was just rested in the car seat. The impact allowed the freedom to go out of the car.
So it's like this. A driver who would wear a seatbelt is 3 times more likely to restrain a child in the car with him. So you probably wonder what I'm doing here. Well, let's try a little experiment. Suppose you're driving down the road at 25. You're in a parking lot, and you have an unrestrained child in the seat next to you. That's not a good idea. The kid's out of a car seat, out of a seatbelt. Well, 25 miles an hour in a parking lot and a little bit of a crash is just about like doing the unthinkable. Throwing your baby from the 3rd floor. Doesn't make any sense, does it? Well, here's the deal. It's not the fall that's going to hurt. It's the sudden stop at the end. And this fall from this height was just the same as an unrestrained child moving forward and hitting the dash. Put the kids in a seatbelt or a car seat.
And not just the kids. None of the victims were wearing seatbelts. Only Lowry beat the odds. As Heinemann continues the on-scene investigation, he dispatches Officer Tom Reyes to follow up with the lone survivor at the hospital.
The light was green, so I don't know what happened. This guy must have hit me. He came out from nowhere.
First, he learns that Lowry's blood alcohol is over the legal limit.
We learned that his blood alcohol concentration was a 0.125.
You should obey traffic signals.
This was several hours after this impact occurred.
Whoops. Oh, no. I almost missed that one.
He was impaired, probably didn't even see the red light. Obviously didn't see the car coming approaching him as well.
Lowry sticks by his story that the other car ran the red light, but he's got some incentive to say so. After all, the only other possible witnesses are dead, and he could face 4 counts of manslaughter if Heinemann can prove it was Lowry's fault. But Heinemann doesn't have that proof yet.
So at this point, John doesn't have any independent eyewitnesses to tell him who actually ran the red light. He's got the only surviving driver that's pointing at the dead guy. There's a surprise, huh? Who's saying, hey, the dead guy ran the red light. What John's going to have to do to get any kind of criminal charges into court is find some objective, independent way with the physical evidence to demonstrate who actually did run the red light in this case. That's the trick for investigators. They need to figure out, using that investigative technique and the physical evidence, how this crash happened. Accident investigator John Heinemann is piecing together one of the worst cases he's ever handled. 4 people are dead, including a 2-year-old who wasn't properly buckled in a car seat. In fact, no one was wearing a seatbelt. There is only one survivor in this crash. Belts aside, alcohol's a factor. Lowry was driving impaired. Still in all, John has to figure out which of the 2 drivers tried to beat the red light. In fact, may not have noticed the red light.
I think she's over there.
The fact that Lowry was driving under the influence makes him more likely to have run the red light. But Heinemann will need proof. And right now, this mystery is offering up few clues.
John's next step is to start collecting and analyzing the physical evidence. Here, there are some car parts in the road, but there are no real tire marks. And tire marks are what the accident investigator is going to use to really piece this together. For him, that lack of tire marks is going to be a real challenge.
With no skid marks, at least one thing is clear. Neither driver was on the brakes when the collision happened. That would explain the violence of the crash.
Obviously, something that came through our mind was that neither one of these drivers saw each other. They didn't react. One of the drivers didn't even react to the red light.
But then Heineman learned something that could turn his theory about the SUV on its head. Results from the medical examiner come in. It turns out Kevin Rogers was also impaired, not by alcohol, but by methamphetamine.
Did you take something?
I took something. I'm with the guys. What do you expect me to do?
We knew we had one impaired driver, and we kind of had a hunch that he may be the one that ran the red signal. Now we had two impaired drivers, one with the alcohol and the other with the drugs.
So it's back to square one. If both drivers were impaired, either one could have ignored the traffic signals. But Heineman knows only one of them really did. Trouble is, how to prove it.
We're just kicking around the idea of how can we find out who ran the red light, and just kind of all of a sudden it hit us. Hey, let's get the bulbs and have those analyzed. And the key to this investigation was rested on the light bulb that I collected at the scene.
When the car knocked down the traffic light, the bulbs in that signal shattered. It occurred to Heineman that by analyzing the filaments in that broken bulb, they could determine which light was on and which was off at the time of the crash. That means investigators will be able to tell who had the green and who had the red when both cars entered the intersection.
What you look at from a forensic examination is that you're looking at the coil structure and you're looking at the shape of the overall filament. In the case of the red, what we have is a fractured filament. These are a cold break, which means it was off at the time it fractured, and you have a series of small coils that have just broken off. If you go to the green, what you see is the same support, but look at your coil structure. You have stretching, you have a breakdown in the general shape. It's no longer in the nice curved C shape. This means that it was soft at the time of the accident, which means that it was on. So because of this type of deformation, we are able to say that the green lamp was on at the time that the vehicle struck the pole.
The hard filament in the cold red light shattered, but soft filaments in the hot green light only bent. Since the downed pole was facing Alex Rogers' car, it's immediately obvious to investigators that he had the green light when he entered the intersection.
What happened was we had the sedan approaching on a red light. The speed wasn't very great. The signal turned green for the sedan. Went not very fast, 25, 30 miles through the intersection, and was T-boned by the SUV at a high rate of speed, which we felt ran the red light.
With the results of the test on the traffic lights, John Heineman can now replay the sequence of events that led to the fatal collision. Amy Rogers and her parents were on their way back home. They were about to cross an intersection, the same intersection John Lowry and his friend were approaching. The family had the green light. The SUV had the red, but never stopped. Nobody was on the brakes when the vehicles collided. Both drivers were impaired, Lowry because of alcohol, Amy's father by drugs, and no one was wearing a seatbelt. The tragic results of all these factors led to 4 people dead and only 1 survivor.
John Lowry's the only survivor in this crash. Like is so often the case, a drunk driver responsible for a collision walks away from it, but he won't get away for long.
Because the other driver was also impaired, Lowry was not charged with the maximum sentence. He finally pled guilty and received a sentence of 8 years in prison.
In the real world, as in dreams, nothing is quite as it seems. Look, I didn't write that, Dean Koontz did, but I've certainly experienced that as an accident investigator. This job is anything but routine. Every once in a while, you run across a case that makes you say, and I thought I'd seen everything. Well, this case is a perfect example.
On an early April evening in New Jersey, a 911 call comes in.
Yes, there's a body lying in the middle of the road at Robertson Way. Looks like he got hit by a car.
Accident investigator Andy Rich works for the local prosecutor's office. He gets to the scene not long after the 911 call has been made. There, the lifeless body of young Matthew Nyland is lying on the side of the road. A quick check reveals that Matthew has just moved into the neighborhood to take a new job. He was due to start work the very next day. The human body is usually one of the most reliable and generous sources of evidence for any crash investigator. But in this case, the body actually deepens the mystery because it doesn't show any of the usual signs of a hit and run.
You've got a pedestrian, you've got some debris in the roadway. Anything else you're going to work on?
Well, right now all I have is ankle injury and some blood coming from the ankle. I don't have any typical injuries I would normally see on a pedestrian hit.
Things like bumper contact to the leg, that sort of thing?
Yeah, lower extremity fractures, head injuries, glass in the hair. I don't have any of that.
At first glance, Andy has no idea what led to this young man's untimely death. One thing he does know is that the clock is ticking.
When you're dealing with a hit and run, time is a big factor. It's very easy to get rid of a car. You could fix it, wash evidence off.
The scene is particularly small and quiet. No witnesses, no bystanders, and little physical evidence. But over by the body, Andy comes across his first clue.
There was one skid mark, and it was very close to the body, and it appeared to be fresh. And we could tell a fresh skid mark from one that may be old. You look at the dirt dispersed around the tire mark. Is it covering the tire mark, or is there obviously a cleaning to the roadway where the dirt's been disturbed? There's also, you could tell if it's a faded skid mark from one that has a lot of fresh rubber laid down.
This single skid mark tends to support the hit-and-run scenario. The driver could have stomped on the brakes to try to avoid hitting the young man. A little further down the street, there's another possible clue. Tire prints made in the ground just off the side of the road.
The tire prints were on the tree belt, and the tree belt is a grassy area that's between the sidewalk and the street. That kind of leads to the scenario that maybe the car goes out of control and then winds up driving off the roadway onto the tree belt.
Andy, how's this car involved?
Well, we ran the plates on all the cars that were parked on this road, and we found out that this one belongs to the victim.
So far, it seems as if Matthew Nyland was leaving his apartment and crossing the street when 50 feet or so down the road, another car went up onto the tree belt. The driver lost control and tried to stop before hitting him, but he couldn't. Instead of sticking around, he fled the scene, leaving Matthew to die. Up to now, there's no indication that this is anything other than a hit and run. But after a closer inspection of the scene, a puzzling find next to the victim's body threatens to deepen the mystery even further.
We did find a hat that was next to the body, and that's also something else that was very odd. It was a 25-mile-per-hour speed zone, and I would expect to find a body approximately 40 feet from the hat, not the hat, 3 feet from the body. It just shouldn't happen.
Now, the reason that the hat, or for example, a pair of glasses, may not end up near a body that's been hit by a car has to do with crash dynamics. I know a thing or two about crash dynamics, but so does Jerry Eubanks. He's an expert in pedestrian crash analysis. Okay, so Jerry, we got the pedestrian set. You're gonna be watching for the hat and the glasses. What else?
Hat and the glasses and shoes. We got 2 shoes that are untied this time, so they should go far down line, maybe 40, 50, 60 feet. Hat and the glasses should stay in this area of impact, although if the glasses are hit by the windshield, they'll start traveling down line.
So glasses, hat, good indication of the area of impact.
Area of impact, not a point of impact.
All right, let's make this happen. Okay. So we have the head crash, and we find that the evidence we expected to see near the point of impact here. For example, the hat, we're only talking about it being about 6 feet from the actual marked point of impact, and about 9 or 10 feet away, we find the glasses and one of the shoes. So everything is exactly where we'd expect to find it.
Back in New Jersey, Andy Rich has Matthew Nyland's body and the hat Nyland was wearing almost right next to each other, not widely separated as the crash dynamics would suggest. Yet a 911 caller claimed Nyland was the victim of a hit and run. For Rich, the evidence is just not adding up.
The body of 23-year-old Matthew Nyland's lying on the side of the road in suburban New Jersey. We've all seen this before. 1 minute, a healthy young kid. The next minute, a grieving family trying to pick up the pieces. Andy Rich is the first stop on that long road. He's here to find out exactly what caused Matthew's death, both for the parents and the authorities. But this case is getting stranger by the moment.
Anytime two objects come in contact with each other, there's going to be a transfer of evidence. We walk the grid, and we walk up and down the roadway, and then we walk up and down the roadway crossways. We change directions. And there were no parts. There were no automotive parts. There were no paint chips.
In fact, the car should not be the only source of evidence in this case. Matthew Nyland's body should also show signs of the collision. Here's why. So, Jerry, accident investigators working pedestrian crashes are going to find evidence from the body on the road, right?
Yes.
What kind of evidence do they look for?
Well, as in this case, we've got clothing fabric. You can find hair, blood, and flesh. Shoe prints also.
Do you have to be dragged by the car for this to show up?
No, in this case, we had the dummy thrown, and when he hits the ground, we get these larger marks, and the smaller mark is a secondary bounce.
So just sliding will get that transfer?
Yes.
After the body gets hit by the car and it's sliding around along the ground, this guy's wearing jeans. Normally, I would expect to find some gene transfer, blue material, that gets rubbed off the jeans onto the pavement.
Back in New Jersey, Andy Rich can't find any signs of transfer at the crash site. But then, just as they're wrapping up their on-scene investigation, Andy gets his first lucky break. Broken glass has been found on a nearby street, glass that may have come from the fleeing car.
What could have happened here is maybe some headlight glass could have broken, got caught on the bumper. The driver takes a very hard turn, and now that glass, because of the force from the turning, gets thrown off that car a block away.
But on closer inspection, Andy's first promising lead quickly evaporates.
It looked like window glass from the side or the rear windshield of a car, not the front. When a front windshield breaks, it stays together because it's laminated. Whereas when the side windows break, they turn into little popcorn-sized kernels, and you just see these little fragments all over the ground. That's what we had here. You know, why a pedestrian would hit and break a side window or a rear window. And I'm looking at it, it doesn't look right, and we interviewed the neighbors, and the neighbors tell us, no, that was there for about a couple of weeks, and the local police actually took a report on it.
Andy and his team leave the accident scene no closer to unlocking the mystery of Matthew Nyland's death. But he can't stop thinking about the case. It's got his mind going. The absence of physical evidence, the hat next to Matthew's body, the strange ankle injury. Something's just not right. And then, later that night, it comes to him.
As normal, I think about what happened at the scene. You know, did I miss anything? And I started thinking, if I jumped from the roof of the apartment building, where would I land? And I just started thinking about that.
It's now the next morning. Rich has been working on the case for more than 12 hours. In the early daylight, he goes back to the scene to take a few measurements at the nearby apartment building. If someone were to jump off the roof or get pushed, they'd land just about where Nyland's body was found. The case has taken a brand new turn. Nyland may have been killed or committed suicide, but Rich isn't concluding anything just yet.
Just because that body was found where I theoretically would think it should have ended up after jumping from that building doesn't mean that that's what happens.
But still, Andy now has a solid working theory that can be validated by further examination of the body. Injuries from a fall are very different from those caused by a car hitting somebody on the street.
It was important to see what the medical examiner had to say. Hey, Doc.
Hey, Andy, how are you?
Okay, what happened?
Well, I want to talk to you about this pattern of fractures on the legs. He's got an oblique fracture in the right thigh, a fracture of the left lower leg, and the interesting pattern of fractures is symmetrical fractures at the ankles. And looking at the x-rays, the way the fractures are situated, to me, it's much more consistent with falling from a height and not from a direct motor vehicle impact.
Okay, thank you.
The medical examiner confirms that Matthew's 2 broken ankles are not at all consistent with a hit and run. But those injuries would correspond with a fall from a height.
Judd, as an expert in collision trauma biomechanics, you see certain types of injuries, and are pedestrian injuries, are they consistent with just that type of event, or are they common to other events?
Pedestrians have a very unique injury pattern. You see very telltale evidence of contact and specific injury patterns to the lower extremity, as well as damage as you proceed, typically up one side of the body, also to the head area. So there is a very distinct pattern.
Things are finally coming together for Andy Rich, but there are more checks to be made. He gets a warrant to search the roof of Matthew Nyland's apartment building. He wants to verify a couple of things he found on one of Nyland's running shoes.
What was found on the bottom of the sneaker, wedged into the treads of the sneaker, was a pebble. And also on the top of the shoe was like a black smear, some type of black transfer. And we noticed on the roof there was tar. There was an impression in the tar that matched the sole of the sneaker. When we went into his apartment, we found medications that's used to treat patients for depression.
Everything is now clear to the investigators. This is not a hit and run, just a very sad story. A desperate young man climbs to the top of his apartment building and jumps. His body lands on the side of the road, making it look like he was hit by a car.
Investigators do just that, they investigate. And in this case, Andy got to the scene of what appeared to be a hit-and-run crash, and he applied his investigative techniques and he solved the case. A good investigator will do that. He relied on his training and experience. He figured out that this wasn't actually a hit-and-run, the hit-and-run it appeared to be. But who made the tire marks? Who made the phone call? We may never know. Ultimately, though, the family's going to have to figure out why the young man ended his life the way he did.
Next, investigators are baffled when a motorcyclist's fatal injuries seem to have come from something other than a motorcycle crash.
We attend the autopsies just to ensure that foul play is not involved. And in doing that, we can rule out a homicide, because unfortunately it's very common for people to use motor vehicle crashes as a cover-up for a homicide.
35-year-old Mike Cooper is coming face to face with some hard realities. His job has become stressful and uninteresting, and his marriage of 12 years is coming to an end.
I'm gonna go get the kids now.
One of the few things he still enjoys is his bike. After a long ride lasting well into the evening, Cooper is returning home when suddenly disaster strikes. On a seemingly harmless corner that he has ridden past hundreds of times, his bike goes down. Trapped under the weight of it, he slides into oncoming traffic and is hit by an approaching SUV. Pronounced dead at the scene, Mike Cooper's body is taken to a nearby hospital. The driver of the SUV, Marcus Schrader, is visibly shaken and waits for a team of collision reconstructionists led by Constable Jeff Vance to arrive. A motorcycle rider himself, Vance will need to answer a series of key questions. What would cause a bike to slide out of control on a quiet residential street? And was someone or something responsible for this wreck?
I approach every investigation like there's endless possibilities that are the root cause of the crash. Once you make an assumption where it's a high speed involved, well, then you have to look at the root causes behind that. What else is going on? Is the accelerator stuck? Is there a mechanical defect? Is it an attempt on the person's life? All of these possibilities have to be looked at and ruled out.
Jeff Vance quickly takes in the scene. The SUV's front end is on top of the curb, with the bike wedged tightly underneath it. Both vehicles lie barely 10 feet past the point of impact. Right away, it's obvious to investigators that Mike Cooper's motorcycle offered him little protection in the crash.
There was just some minor undercarriage damage to the sport utility vehicle, and that only made sense. And the motorcycle itself, there were some significant forces that actually acted upon that, which caused the entire frame to twist, as well as the engine itself to break. The motorcycle and the driver, within milliseconds, changed direction. And you can only imagine the force on the human body associated with that. But also, too, if you can imagine the sport utility vehicle, because it is higher, if someone is sliding along, they go underneath it, there's not only a force pushing them in the opposite direction, but as well as there's also a downward force on the occupant and the motorcycle. And this, in turn, projected the driver approximately 45 feet from the area of impact.
Constable Jeff Vance has a pretty horrific crash scene on his hands. Got a motorcycle crashed head-on into an SUV. Doesn't need a physics degree to figure out who's going to win that battle. Now, what he's got left over is the SUV driver who's telling one version of the story. That's the human element. But he still has the vehicles and the environment to deal with. They'll tell the rest of the story.
In the majority of investigations, it is the human element that poses the most difficulty for investigators. Survivors involved in fatal collisions can be severely traumatized by their experience. Their recollection of events is often clouded by guilt and remorse.
There's a wide range, actually, of the way that people react to traumatic situations such as this. Everything from a denial, such as there's nothing wrong, I haven't done anything wrong, right through to an absolute collapse, where people can't handle the stress and collapse, and also do require immediate medical attention.
Next thing I know, he slides towards me. I try to avoid him. I don't think he was speeding.
It is very common for these people that have, say, for example, seriously injured or killed someone.
Person in the car at the time?
There is a significant number of them that actually become alcoholics or drug addicts as a result of these crashes, because they don't obtain the assistance they require, even if they're not considered at fault in the crash.
In this case, Marcus Schrader appears to be in the middle of the two extremes. After repeated attempts to get a statement, he is finally composed enough to offer police his version of events. To get at the truth of exactly what happened here, investigators will compare Schrader's story with the physical evidence at the scene.
Everyone has a different perception of the truth, and it is unfortunate, but it is in human nature that people omit things or add things to their beliefs that would assist them in any way possible.
So, Jeff, you've had a chance to talk to the driver. What's he told you?
He was driving along, minding his own business in the fast lane, saw the motorcyclist lose control, slide into his lane. He tried to maneuver around the motorcycle and swerve into the curb lane. Unfortunately, they hit.
So he fixated on the target. That's not uncommon for a non-professional driver. Professional drivers are often taught to steer toward the dust and debris because the crash has already been there and left. For the rest of us, unfortunately, we tend to follow the action too often, and it's unfortunate for this guy.
If Marcus Schrader had swerved to his left instead of his right, chances are this fatal impact would have been avoided. By steering to his right, Schrader inadvertently put his SUV on a collision course with the motorcycle. However, investigators find no evidence his SUV was skidding before impact, suggesting his speed was low and that he had little time to react. Working back from the SUV, they are able to follow debris and scrapes left by Cooper's motorcycle to a tire mark on the opposite side of the road. The absence of skid marks and the trail of motorcycle debris leading up to the point of impact clearly indicate that the SUV did not collide with the bike before it went down. Schrader's version of events appears to be the truth. It appears that Mike Cooper's bike simply fell and slid across the road into the path of Schrader's SUV. The big question is why?
So when you take a look at this crash scene, we're still trying to figure out what would cause this guy to lay the bike down and end up underneath the SUV. Well, one of the issues is speed, or potentially is speed. So Jeff's looking into the coefficient of friction, the stickiness of the roadway and tire combination, together with a little bit of math to try to figure out how fast this guy actually was going when he laid the bike down across the center line of the road.
From the evidence littering the road, Jeff Vance determines that Mike Cooper was traveling at just 30 miles per hour when he lost control of his motorcycle. Slightly over the speed limit, but well under the capabilities of both the motorcycle and its experienced rider.
It was very important to determine how fast the motorcycle was driving and maneuvering the corner. He wasn't traveling at a high rate of speed, so it posed a question to me then, what would cause it? If someone is going too fast for the corner and loses control, then it's completely understandable. But if someone's taking a corner around the speed limit, it just doesn't make sense for a motorcycle to lose control and for the driver to die as a result of it.
After hours at the scene, police are still no closer to explaining how or why Mike Cooper lost his life.
A motorcyclist is dead after a crash with an SUV. Jeff Vance, the lead investigator in the case, has quite a puzzle on his hands. When a motorcycle's in a turn, there's sideways forces and up and down forces acting on the bike. You adjust those forces by your lean angle, adjusting your speed, and braking. Jeff's wondering, did the rider in this case actually do something that upset that balance? He's hoping the body will give him some clues.
We attend the autopsies just to ensure that foul play is not involved. And we do that through ensuring that the injury profile on the individual is consistent with the damage to the vehicles and the accident scene. And in doing that, we can rule out a homicide, because unfortunately it's very common for people to use motor vehicle crashes as a cover-up for a homicide.
The medical exam reveals that the victim's leg was badly scraped and his foot crushed. His skin was literally torn inside out during the slide-out and the impact with the SUV. The injury is horrific, but not fatal. A toxicology report shows alcohol in the bloodstream at the time of his death. But the levels are so low, Jeff Vance quickly discounts any theory that Mike Cooper was driving while impaired. As the autopsy draws to a close, the medical examiner calls Jeff's attention to the victim's head x-rays. They clearly reveal the cause of death, but they also send the entire investigation back to the starting line. A hole in the skull, just above the left eye, produced massive trauma and significant blood loss. A helmet was recovered at the crash scene, but this injury suggests a helmet was not being worn at the time of the collision. When could the injury have occurred? Did Mike Cooper hit something that caused him to lose control of his motorcycle? Or did something or someone hit him? Jeff Vance will need to carefully re-examine the bike to find the answers.
When a motorcycle hits a car, you don't expect them to die of a puncture wound to the head, especially if they're wearing a helmet. More typically, you'd expect them to have had injuries to their neck or to their internal organs. Their aorta can even be just torn off and they can bleed internally and die within minutes.
Back at the police garage, Jeff Vance now knows what killed Mike Cooper, a puncture wound to the head. Revealing how the wound was caused will determine if the crash was an elaborate hoax to cover another crime or a catastrophic failure of a vital piece of safety equipment. Examining his personal effects, Jeff Vance quickly determines that Mike Cooper sealed his own fate the moment he put on his most important piece of protective gear, his helmet.
Examination of the helmet itself, the label that was on the inside stating that this was a novelty helmet not meant for safety purposes. There is no padding on the inside at all, which has no energy absorption material at all. And this would also explain some of the trauma to this driver's head as well. If you can imagine the motorcycle sliding on its side, moving across 3 lanes of traffic, and being struck by a northbound sport utility vehicle. So basically, his head went up and struck the turn signal on the handlebar of the motorcycle, because that also hit the sport utility vehicle's bumper. And we know this through the examination with tissue being found on the turn signal, as well as the damage to his skull.
So Jeff's had a chance to look at the bike, and he's got the rider dynamics figured out. As the rider went into the slide, he fell to the pavement, and the cheesy helmet struck the roadway, moving off his head and offering him less protection. So that when the bike hits the SUV, the rider goes forward, his unprotected head now hits the turn indicator. What Jeff's got to do next is to figure out what caused that bike to lean and then slide out.
While examining the bike, trying to determine what caused Mike Cooper's fatal slide, investigator Jeff Vance is repeatedly drawn to the tires of his motorcycle. Shiny and slippery to the touch, it appears as if the sides had been polished with a product designed to keep car tires from fading or cracking. Could the polish have affected the motorcycle's handling on the night of the crash?
Being a motorcycle rider myself, I know that the tires aren't that shiny. I went over and felt them, and there was a very slippery substance on them. And it actually went around the whole tread, except for the travel portion, a very thin, narrow strip on the center of the tire itself. I was thinking to myself, that's not right. And I thought to myself, well, that will significantly reduce the speed that this motorcycle will be able to take the corner. And I was thinking to myself, could this be it? Because I've never come across something like this before.
So Jeff, do you have any working theories about why the bike went down?
Yes, I found some contamination on the tires. They're really slippery, and I think that lowered the coefficient of friction between the tire and the road enough for the motorcycle to slide out. Can you give me a hand doing a lean test on the bike, just to see where the contamination starts?
Sure, let's do that. What can I do for you?
If you just lean the bike over towards me, and I'll let you know when the contamination touches the road. Okay, you can just go up a little bit. Okay, that's perfect.
So what did you get?
I got 20 degrees, and that's well within the normal range of a novice driver.
A quick test in the garage shows that a 20-degree lean angle is all that is required to have the polished area of the tire meet the asphalt. On a test track, can a motorcycle going the posted speed limit through a similar corner exceed that 20-degree lean angle?
The shape of a bike tire is not like what you find on a car. This bike tire is more oval. When you're driving down the road just straight and level, the contact patch is right down here in the center. When you go through a turn, that contact patch spreads around the sides. We know there's a relationship in a turn between lean angle and speed and, of course, the roadway friction. In this case, what we want to do is figure out if a lean angle in this scenario will get us past 20 degrees. That'd be about here. A more aggressive turn will be further out on the sidewalk.
On a corner with the same curvature as the one at the crash scene, a rider maintaining 30 miles per hour easily exceeds a 20-degree lean angle while executing the turn.
Not a terribly taxing demonstration for our rider. He made it to 20 degrees without any difficulty. But if you change the friction at that point on the tire, you'd probably have this bike slide out. It's interesting. You got to wonder, why would someone put that much stuff on that kind of tire on purpose?
It seems inconceivable that Mike Cooper, an experienced rider, would put a slippery automotive polish on his own tires, where it could actually contact the road. Jeff Vance continues to examine the hours leading up to the crash for any evidence that someone could have deliberately tampered with his bike. Homicide detectives follow up on the suspicions, but they can find nothing to suggest that foul play was a factor in the crash. Instead, it appears that Mike Cooper's zeal to have good-looking tires and a vintage helmet clouded his judgment. Jeff Vance began his investigation with a commitment to finding the cause of this crash and to explain how a low-speed impact killed a fellow motorcycle rider. He now has his answers. After a long ride to clear his head, Mike Cooper is returning home on a road he has ridden hundreds of times before. As he rounds a curve, his lean angle exceeds 20 degrees, putting an area of his tires slick with polish into contact with the asphalt. In a split second, his bike is down and sliding into the path of an SUV driven by Marcus Schrader. On impact, his head collides with the handlebars before his body is thrown into the grass on the side of the road. Evidence from the scene, the medical exam, and the motorcycle itself paints a picture of a man who made a series of poor judgments. Using a rubber polish on his own tires and choosing to ride without a proper helmet ultimately sealed Mike Cooper's fate.
I've investigated over 1,200 collisions now, and I cannot think of one of them being an accident. They are avoidable. It's as simple as that. Driver error is a huge factor in all of these, let it be speed or alcohol or just inattentiveness. There is not, I have not come across a true accident myself.
man mourns the loss of his sister after a terrifying head-on collision.
Officer.
But he offers investigators few details about the driver who caused the crash and then fled the scene.
Our passenger had a knee injury. My suspicion is that's where it came from.
Then a domestic dispute escalates out of control and ends in tragedy. A grieving boyfriend suddenly finds himself facing a possible homicide charge. And a driver mysteriously loses control of his 80,000-pound rig, slamming into 3 cars. Can investigators figure out what triggered the deadly chain of events and who was at fault? Every year, violent collisions kill 40,000 Americans and injure another 3 million. But there is no such thing as an accident. Every collision has a story, as unique as the people involved. Rusty Haight is a leading authority on accident reconstruction. He trains investigators around the world to read the clues and solve the mysteries.
Sometimes we get the front end of the car to ramp up. I'm not sure why that happened. I'll have to look at the information, the data, and the video, and we'll sort it out. But for now, that was pretty interesting. So, 40 miles an hour head-on into another car might seem crazy to you, but for me, it's pretty much just another day at the office. And there's a good reason for these kind of crash tests. We can learn a lot about the physics behind the crashes and the potential for injury. This was at 40. Imagine one at 70. Could someone walk away from that crash? Well, that's what the investigators in Maryland are trying to find out.
A quiet spring night in suburban Maryland is suddenly rocked by the sound of a violent impact. 2 passenger cars collide at a busy intersection. Emergency workers discover a victim in each car, both dead. The first police officers on the scene take a statement from a lone witness and immediately put in a call for accident investigator Gary Lewis. Gary's job will be to answer the tough questions. What led to this fatal collision, and who, if anyone, was at fault? His first task is to survey the damage done to a vehicle driven by 28-year-old Ken Jones.
The first impression upon arriving on the scene of this wreck, it was a very violent wreck. There was a lot of damage to both of the vehicles involved. One of the vehicles was located on the southwest corner of the intersection, about 50 feet off the roadway. The other vehicle was about 250 feet, I think, south of the intersection. During the post-crash travel, it rolled, it flipped, it spun. It had damage pretty much all the way around the vehicle. And the occupant of that vehicle, they had obvious head trauma. They had obvious deformation of the chest area. That occupant was belted at the time, but because of the way this wreck happened and the forces involved in this wreck, it wasn't enough to prevent injury or fatal injury.
The horror Lewis discovers in the first car is matched by the second. A young woman, Sarah Hunt, has submarined. It's a term investigators use for an unbelted passenger who slides underneath their airbag, colliding with the dashboard at high speed.
There's massive swelling in the brain because of the injury to the small nerves and the blood vessels. That swelling or edema within the brain can actually increase the pressure inside of the brain to such an extent that the heart is unable to pump blood flow to the brain adequately. In that case, what will happen is that the brain will eventually die.
Seeing an unbelted passenger submarine is not unusual in a head-on crash, but finding the rest of the car totally empty is surprising. Gary Lewis knows that the driver has walked away from this wreck and is likely in need of immediate medical attention. The clock is ticking.
Gary's got a really tough job ahead of him tonight. He's got tire marks to deal with, gouges, evidence from the roadway, evidence from the cars. He's got folks that are supposed to have walked away from this crash. He's looking for at least one driver. This is going to be an interesting night. That anyone could have walked away from either of these cars is a real testament to the safety systems and the design of these cars, their ability to crush and absorb energy and protect occupants, airbags, seat belts, limiting injury so someone can leave the scene. A real important aspect of car safety.
As Gary Lewis continues to investigate the scene, a fellow officer just blocks away sees a man stumbling through a mall parking lot.
Officer.
Yes, sir.
was just in an accident.
Jason Hunt flags down the patrol car and tells police he was a passenger in a car with his sister and her friend David when suddenly they crashed.
He's like in his terrible twos. Everything is making a right.
So you need an ambulance?
Yeah.
Stunned by the impact, he came to and realized that the driver David was gone and his sister needed help. What caused the wreck is still a mystery, but it's no mystery why Jason survived. He was wearing a seatbelt.
It's really no surprise that people survive this crash. Despite speed, it's not speed that kills you, it's a sudden stop at the end. And that's what we have here. This egg had a very sudden stop at the end, very abrupt stop. This egg didn't have such an abrupt stop. It stopped from the same speed, but it stopped over a longer period of time. That was the key. And how do we equate an egg landing in a pillow to a car crash? Well, we take advantage in a car crash of crumple zones. The cars collapse and crunch, and that takes time. It may be milliseconds in the bigger picture, but in the real world, in a crash, that's a long period of time. And we can extend that by taking advantage of seatbelts. Once you've stretched the belts, now you're going to continue to move forward a little bit. That's where the airbag comes into play. All of this together, we extend the time, we protect the egg.
Where did it happen?
It's right over there.
While Jason has suffered minor injuries, he claims to remember little about the accident itself, and the driver David remains at large. Fortunately for investigators, a lone witness was willing to talk to police. Combining his witness statements with roadway evidence collected at the scene, Gary Lewis is now able to piece together the chain of events that led to the deadly collision.
You got quite a mess here. What's going on?
From what the witness is telling us and the roadway evidence we found on the scene so far, it appears we had a vehicle traveling in this direction, went to make a left down the side street, and was hit by an oncoming car. That impact knocked the turning car the whole way down there, over 200 feet from the intersection, and the striking vehicle ended up here on the curb.
We got 2 dead. You've got 1 overturned. You've got a whole lot of tire marks and gouge marks and material to work with, and the other car all tore up on the curb line. You got a lot of work tonight.
It's going to be a long night.
Yeah.
Gary Lewis is off to a good start, but it will take more painstaking work to determine which car caused the accident and what happened to the driver who left Sarah Hunt to die in the passenger seat of his car.
Accident investigator Gary Lewis is struggling with the devastating crash scene spread across some 200 feet of suburban Maryland roadway. He's got 2 cars at the scene, each containing a dead body. He's got 1 driver that's still there and 1 that's missing. And the best hope police have of finding that missing driver lies with Jason Hunt, who's lost his own sister in this crash.
All right, I'm just going to touch you lightly, okay? You let me know if it hurts.
Another member of my unit had responded down to the hospital where a suspect was taken from this wreck. Someone who said they were involved in the wreck, but not driving.
So you were in a car accident?
Yeah.
Okay. Were you driving?
No.
All right.
They told the officer that they were seated in the right rear seat and that they were wearing a seatbelt when the wreck happened. In fact, the officer looked at this person and saw a seatbelt mark. However, the seatbelt mark he saw went from the left shoulder to the lower right part of the abdomen, which is not indicative of a passenger side seatbelt.
I think you're just a little banged up. You didn't fare.
The officer also indicated that this person had received some bruising to the knees and that his jeans were either torn or brushed. There was some kind of an abrasion mark on the jeans, and he was complaining about bruising and soreness in the knees. He also had some injuries on the back of his hand that were consistent with impact from glass, the dicing that occurs in a wreck when it shatters into a lot of small pieces.
So how did you do this? How did this happen?
I punched a window.
Really? In the car?
Yeah.
Investigators are confident that Jason Hunt can give them some personal insight into the crash that killed his sister Sarah and 28-year-old Ken Jones. But when his version of events starts to conflict with the evidence uncovered at the scene, Jason Hunt unwittingly puts the spotlight on himself.
Sarah!
people get in crashes, they think of a lot of goofy excuses, especially when they're trying to get out of trouble. If it serves them, they'll come up with the wildest ideas. Hitting, for example, glass in a window isn't going to do anything. Hurt your hand a little bit, but it isn't going to do anything. So somebody that's sought treatment or somebody that's claiming that they've hit the window, trying to get somebody out, they're not getting anything. It takes a lot of effort from an airbag to crack the window. And you're not going to do it with your hand. It's going to take a lot more on the side. In the movies, you know, you see the star cracking it with his elbow. Not in real life. The car is going to give us the evidence. The car doesn't have a dog in this fight. Okay, people do.
While unimpressed with Jason Hunt's explanation for his injuries, Gary Lewis has little choice but to keep looking for David, the missing driver. As officers continue the search, Lewis begins an examination of the car and the safety systems that saved Hunt's life. What they reveal threatens to further destroy his credibility as a reliable witness.
Our passenger in this wreck originally said he was seated in the right rear seating position. We look at that and we see the seatbelt has no signs of being used in this crash. But yet our passenger had a mark on his chest, and that mark was consistent with signs of a driver's side seatbelt, not a passenger's. So we turned our attention to the left rear seating position. We see that that seatbelt is retracted completely into the retractor, and in fact it's tucked in behind the seat cushion with no indicators of use during a wreck. So then we turn to the front seat. And we see that our front seat belt does have some signs of use in a wreck. It's been locked out. It's been locked out by an impact, consistent with use in a front crash.
Further examination of the car continues to erode Jason Hunt's carefully constructed alibi.
Our passenger in this wreck had a knee injury to his left knee with some abrasion and some marks on his jeans in that area also, the left knee. My suspicion is that's where it came from. What I'll do is I'll take this dash console, send it to our lab for analysis to see if it matches up with the fibers from his pants and therefore relate that injury to that mark in the vehicle.
While in the hospital exam room, Jason Hunt also submits to a blood alcohol test. More than 2 hours have elapsed since the crash, and it comes back at 0.11, well over 0.08, the legal limit for anyone driving in the state of Maryland. For Gary Lewis, this is the last remaining piece of the puzzle. The physical evidence paints a clear picture as to who was behind the wheel at the time of the collision. Jason Hunt. The glass injuries to the back of his hand, the seatbelt data, and the fibers from his jeans in the dash console all place Hunt squarely in the driver's seat. The blood alcohol finding suggests a likely motive for fleeing the scene. It's obvious now that Jason's story about David was complete fiction, a ruse to divert suspicion from himself.
The experience I've had with people who leave the scene of a wreck, most times that driver had an agenda. He wanted out of there. He did not want to talk to the police. He was either drunk, suspended, his license privilege suspended. He may have been wanted for something. He might have done another crime that we don't even know about yet and was trying to get away, but he definitely did not want to meet the police or didn't want to hang around to be accountable for what he did.
But one key question still remains. Which driver was at fault? Jason's blood alcohol level aside, Gary will need to determine why the cars collided in the first place. To do that, he must examine the airbag control module in Jason's car. The readings captured at the time of the crash can tell him exactly how fast his car was going when it entered the intersection.
Gary's analysis and the data from the airbag control module tell us that the straight-through car is doing about 67 miles an hour. The left-turning car has been robbed of time. That's the idea behind miles per hour, meters per second, cubits per fortnight. Whatever we're doing, we're talking about distance and time. And when you go faster, you short someone time. If we know the point of impact's here, that's a fixed point. And we know we're going to start and go at 67 miles an hour a certain distance. If we were actually going 55 miles an hour, starting at that same point, we would never have made it to the point of impact. We would have missed a crash. So going too fast, a little impairment, next thing you know, you've robbed someone with some precious time to clear the intersection.
It's clear from the roadway evidence and data from the airbag control module that Jason Hunt's car was simply going too fast for Ken Jones to get out of the way. If Jason had stuck to the speed limit through the intersection, this night could have ended very differently. Barely 24 hours after the fatal collision, Gary Lewis is finally able to say exactly how this wreck came about. Jason Hunt is speeding southbound as he approaches a red light. Meanwhile, Ken Jones finally gets his green and enters the intersection to make a left turn, unaware what is coming up and over a hill in his direction. Ken Jones has no time to react as Hunt's car enters the intersection at 70 miles an hour. The force sends Jones' car flying backwards. When it lands, it rolls 200 feet downhill where it finally stops. Ken Jones is killed on impact, suffering massive internal injuries. His bones are literally crushed by the force of the crash. Inside Hunt's car, his sister, unbelted, submarines under the airbag and is killed when her head slams into the dash. Gary Lewis examines the physical evidence at the scene as well as the injuries to the only surviving passenger, Jason Hunt. Despite efforts to lead him astray, he concludes that Jason Hunt is actually the missing driver. His work offers the Jones family some consolation. Jason Hunt is sentenced to 8 years in prison.
When you've been drinking, to put together a good, believable alibi, a good story is no small feat, or so I've been told. And then add to that potential for a head injury, the dazed and confused effect. Things get kind of complicated for someone trying to deal with a competent investigator. And in this case, what Gary did as a competent investigator was use the objective physical evidence from the cars, the bodies, the roadway, and piece together a good, solid reconstruction. He figured out what happened. Okay, something he'll do now, and in the next case, and in the next case, the same way.
Let me see my kid.
Move out of the way.
No! Why don't you let me see my kid?
Would you give me some money?
You're
out every night spending money on beer and God knows what.
Oh, for crying out loud, whatever!
In the early part of the evening, neighbors close to the home of a young family hear yet another shouting match.
My kid! I just gave you money, okay?
For what?
For your groceries.
Jenny Franklin and Patrick Hall, parents of a 3-year-old toddler, are at it again. The argument is about money. Money Patrick borrowed from Jenny.
Wait a minute. I'm not finished with you yet.
Finally, Jenny has had enough and decides to drive over to her mother's house to pick up their daughter. Upset and distracted by the argument, she makes what will prove to be a fatal mistake. She neglects to fasten her seatbelt. Patrick isn't finished arguing and quickly follows Jenny's car in his own. By the time they reach a deserted stretch of road in the Maryland suburbs, both cars are flying, and Jenny's car isn't going to make it all the way around a curve. Jenny Franklin is ejected from her car and dies on the way to the hospital. Frank Carson, a senior accident investigator, gets the call. It'll be his job to find out exactly what caused this tragedy.
Road rage is pretty much a fact of life. Folks will do things in their car they wouldn't necessarily do face-to-face. The car gives us a certain amount of anonymity. When you're upset, you also do things you may regret the rest of your life. In this instance, could the boyfriend have come up and rear-ended the girlfriend's car and done that in an act of passion? We need to know.
When I originally got to the scene, I had 2 cars there, and the victim, the one vehicle, the deceased, had been transported to the hospital. She was gone from the scene. The only person left, aside from the officers at the scene, was the driver of the other car.
Patrick Hall is on the side of the road when the first officer arrives at the crash scene. He is not seriously injured, but he is in shock. He immediately tells police that it was an accident and explains to the officer what happened.
The boyfriend came around the curve and he saw another vehicle in the roadway. He hit his brakes and swerved to one side to avoid hitting that car. He ends up going off the road. His car ends up on its side. He climbs out of the car and he realizes the other car that's in the roadway is his girlfriend's car. And he looks around. That's when he sees his girlfriend laying in the roadway. The car that she was driving is smoking, and he thinks it's going to catch on fire, so he grabs his girlfriend and drags her over the shoulder of the road, tries to do what first aid he can, and then calls 911 to get an ambulance.
Send an ambulance!
So this guy's story is he just came up on the accident scene and he didn't have any time to stop. Is that possible? Well, it is. But accident scenes and hazards in the road don't just appear in front of you magically.
They're in the road, and the deal is you have to be able to see them. That's why we have headlights. You can overdrive your headlights. You can drive faster than your headlights will illuminate in front of you. And when you do that, you've created a problem for yourself. You can't avoid things that all of a sudden appear, and then, out of nowhere, you have to be able to stop in time to avoid them.
Frank Carson walks around the scene looking for physical evidence, a tire mark, a car part, any clue as to what could have caused the accident. If he finds out that Patrick is lying, the investigation could quickly shift to a homicide. He needs to go back in time and figure out what happened in the last minutes of Jenny Franklin's life.
The tire marks from her car can be seen coming around the curve, leaving the roadway. This poor girl in this car wasn't wearing a seatbelt, and she struck the embankment, then the tree so violently it caused her vehicle to rotate, and the vehicle rotated so violently that she was ejected from the window of the vehicle. And tragically, if she had been, there was little enough damage to the passenger compartment of the vehicle that if she had been wearing her seatbelt, she would have stayed in the vehicle. The airbag would have gone off to partially protect her, and there's a very good possibility she would still be alive.
Frank Carson also has a medical background. He worked for several years in the emergency room and on ambulances. So he's seen plenty of fatal accidents and knows exactly what injury would have ended the young woman's life.
What killed her is an injury called a transected aorta. The aorta is the largest artery. It's on the top of the heart, and it's about as big around as your thumb, and it leads into the heart. When you're sitting up, your heart is, for all intents and purposes, suspended by tissue, and it just hangs there. What happens when you're in a collision and you suffer a violent deceleration? You go forward, the heart goes forward, then you go backward, and the heart goes backward. Well, unfortunately, when that happens, the aorta tears because of that motion. And once that aorta tears, unless it happens right there and there's a medical team standing by, very few people survive that.
Honey,
This poor girl in this car, if she had been wearing a seatbelt, she would be here today, raising her child, sending him to school, and enjoying all those things that parents do. Because she didn't do this, click, put on a seatbelt, she's dead. And it's a very simple thing. It takes you how many seconds to put on your seatbelt? Second, you should get to the point where you back down your driveway, you put it on. It should be instinct. You should feel naked without it on, but people don't do that.
Jenny's boyfriend was wearing his seatbelt, and that's very likely what allowed him to walk away when his car crashed shortly after Jenny's.
The boyfriend's car was on the opposite side of the roadway, was sitting up on its end on their side.
Well, that must have been a wild ride. You know, by the time you're 30, half the population will have been involved in a collision. And collisions bring on symptoms of post-traumatic stress syndrome. In this case, there's no surprise this guy's upset.
So can you tell me what happened here?
Well, my girlfriend and I, we just had a fight at the house.
Indeed, even an hour after he made his 911 call, Patrick Hall is still shaken and stressed out.
But she was going way too fast. And
The boyfriend, when I talked to him, was walking around agitated, upset, trying to figure out how he was going to explain what happened to the girlfriend's family, to the child when the child got old enough, and trying to figure out for himself what exactly had happened. All things very typical of someone who's been in a traumatic situation, had experienced it, remembered it, and was still there. He was fully aware of what was going on.
I just heard this when I swerved.
Hall tells Carson it was a heated argument that led him and Jenny to be on this road, on this evening, in separate cars. For Carson, that's a key part of the puzzle and could lead to serious consequences for Hall.
You don't understand.
I am a father, okay?
So no, you're not. You're a loser. That's what you are.
When the boyfriend explained to me that they had had a domestic argument, that made me think for just a couple minutes there may be something more to it than just an accident. There's a possibility that this may have been an intentional act. When you get to the scene of one of these collisions, you have to think of all the possibilities. And that's one thing that made me think this may be something outside of just, for all intents and purposes, a regular automobile collision.
In other words, it's just possible Hall was angry enough to try to teach his girlfriend a lesson, maybe by giving her car a bump. If that's true, it's also possible the bump made her lose control and then lose her life.
Alcohol's not a factor here, so what Frank's going to have to do is rely on his investigative skills to sort out the objective physical evidence, to figure out how fast the cars were going, who was where, whether the boyfriend was telling the truth or whether the boyfriend's going to jail. His first task will be to figure out the car's speeds. From that, he can sort out where the boyfriend's car was when the girlfriend's car left the road and went out of control.
Coming up, investigators uncover more clues that seem to show a woman's death was no accident. And later, a truck driver with an impeccable safety record stands to lose it all, unless he can explain why his rig suddenly spun out of control and killed 2 drivers.
Over the course of his career, Frank Carson's handled 3 cases where someone used a vehicle as a murder weapon. So when he's called out to a multiple crash site involving a couple who'd been having a heated argument, he's immediately suspicious.
Jenny Franklin was ejected from her vehicle and pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital. But the boyfriend, Patrick, insists that her car crashed before he came around the bend in the road. Frank's job is to find out whether or not Patrick's telling the truth. The first step is to figure out how fast his car was going before it went off the road. The skid marks left by the boyfriend's car are the silent witness. Frank measures the marks and he finds they're 63 feet long. He applies a little bit of math and he knows Patrick was going 37 miles an hour.
Even if he leaves the collision scene, Carson still has a lot of work to do to figure out why Jenny lost control on the curve. But first, he needs more information on Jenny and Patrick's relationship. And he gets it when he conveys the tragic news to Jenny's parents. Frank becomes even more suspicious of Patrick Hall's story.
You can't believe him.
Between the girlfriend's family and the boyfriend, they've been fighting recently.
They were fighting just today.
They explained to me that there had been some arguing and that they had their own suspicions that, again, this wasn't just an automobile collision.
Did anyone see the accident?
They didn't quite believe the story that I was relaying to them that the boyfriend had told me.
You look at him. You look at him.
I have already talked to him.
And what did
He
he tell
stayed
you?
at the scene. He told me pretty much what I just related to you.
They've never got along well.
He must have run her off the road.
Investigators obviously can't let their emotions overrule the facts, and right now there's no real proof that Patrick Hall caused his girlfriend's car to crash.
He should be locked up.
Typically, statistically, our fatal collisions happen at night. They happen within a short distance of where the person lives, and there's some kind of excessive speed involved. So this all made it also look like, and there were skid marks on the roadway to indicate that. The path of travel of her vehicle indicated that she had left the roadway. For all those reasons, it looked on that blush as just a typical collision, because all those facts were there. But that's, again, you have to look at all aspects of these collisions and not just take one part of it and run with it.
Even an experienced crash investigator can draw conclusions when they first roll up on a crash scene. They see a narrow, winding road, cars in the middle of the road all overturned, and a warning sign, an advisory sign that tells people there's a problem. You need to slow down for some reason. Unfortunately, sometimes drivers don't make that connection. You got a warning sign that says 25. It's there for a reason. It's so you slow down to give you a little bit of time to react to hazards in front of you that, because of the winding, narrow conditions, might not be visible early on.
If Hall bumped Jenny's car, there should be evidence on one or both vehicles.
The first thing I look for in a case like that, contact between 2 vehicles, you look for some kind of evidence transfer. And the most typical thing I find in these cases is paint transfer. Looking at the boyfriend's car, there's no red paint on the front end.
The evidence suggests the 2 cars didn't actually make contact, but Frank's got to take it a step further. He's got to figure out exactly where on the road Patrick's car was when his girlfriend's car came into view.
Frank knows Hall was driving 37 miles per hour. When he saw his girlfriend's car, it took him about 2.5 seconds to react. That takes him 137 feet behind the start of the skid marks, on the other side of the curve. In other words, Patrick could not possibly have tried to bump his girlfriend intentionally, because he started hitting his brakes over 100 feet before he even got to Jenny's car. This physical evidence is clear.
I was able to figure out that the boyfriend could not have run into her vehicle, was too far behind her. As a matter of fact, didn't even see the collision when it occurred, which tended to prove the boyfriend's story that he comes around the curve and there's a car in the roadway and he swerves to avoid it.
I am a father, okay?
So no, you're not.
Frank can now say exactly how and why Jenny's tragic accident occurred. After an argument with Patrick, she rushes out of the house to pick up her daughter. She's driving too fast for the road she's on and has not fastened her seatbelt. At a particularly sharp bend in the road, she simply loses control of her car. She hits a tree and begins to rotate. Because she is not buckled in, she is ejected, and the force tears her aorta, a fatal injury. Just seconds later, Patrick Hall rounds the curve and has to avoid hitting both Jenny and her car, sending his own car out of control and onto its side. No charges were filed against Patrick Hall.
We may never know for sure what caused this woman to lose control on this road in this particular instance. You know what, though? Speed played a big role. She was going too fast on this road for these conditions. Not a good thing. Another thing that played a role was her attitude, her distraction. She had her mind on something else. She was upset. When you're upset, when you've got your mind on something else, when you'd rather be doing something other than driving, it's time to pull over and do that something else. Driving demands your attention. Pay attention to the driving task or pull over until you can.
Next, can a damaged fender and a smear of rubber tell investigators what triggered a deadly tractor-trailer crash that has left 2 drivers dead?
You know, being in heavy traffic is bad enough, but being behind a tractor-trailer is where a lot of drivers are uncomfortable. There's a U.S. Department of Transportation survey that says 1 in 4 truck drivers reported falling asleep behind the wheel in the last month, some of them twice. Now, if a driver was to fall asleep, drift off the roadway, and then try to suddenly correct back onto the road, he can jackknife his truck and even roll it over, causing a pretty substantial pileup. For investigators, that's one possibility of a crash involving a tractor-trailer and 3 cars.
Jeff and Monica Lee are fed up with city living. Contemplating a move to the country, they spend their evenings searching for a new home.
It was very nice. I just worry about the travel.
You don't mind driving, come on.
Returning into town late one night, they find themselves beside an 18-wheeler driven by experienced trucker Bill Halliday. Then, without warning, disaster strikes. Within a matter of seconds, the 80,000-pound rig skids across 4 lanes of traffic, striking 3 cars. 2 drivers are killed instantly when their vehicles collide head-on with the truck. Jeff Lee's SUV, however, is only slightly damaged as it collides with the truck's back end. He and his wife suffer only minor injuries and are taken to the hospital. Truck driver Bill Halliday also walks away unscathed. By examining the vehicles at the scene, their tire marks, and the scattered debris, accident investigator Brad Muir and his team hope to solve the mystery of what suddenly caused this tractor-trailer to lose control. The victims' cars offer the first clue. They tell investigators that this crash developed very quickly.
In the curb lane, there was a set of skid marks that were left by the car that was the most seriously damaged, which was the one that came to rest in front of the truck. That shows me that the driver of that car saw something happen in front of him to the point of panic braking, where he applied the brakes suddenly enough that tires locked and he skid, and then suddenly this transport truck was on top of him. The other driver coming along, there was no reaction apparent by his actions, nothing that I could see that indicated he knew anything was coming, until suddenly this transport truck appeared in front of him and he was in a serious crash.
The initial roadway evidence seems to suggest that Halliday's truck triggered the accident, but Brad Muir knows there's a lot of work left to be done.
People driving by a crash like this are going to see the truck and the cars all tangled up, and they're going to probably assume, oh, the truck driver was going too fast or been driving too many hours. Maybe he was on some sort of drugs, but it could be a number of other reasons that could have caused this crash. Somebody cut the driver off. Any number of things could have happened. These guys are going to have to sort out the human, the vehicle, the environment, HVE, to figure out how this crash happened.
The most puzzling question facing investigators involves the fourth vehicle in this crash. The Lees have been taken to the hospital. Although shaken up, their SUV tells investigators they experienced only a minor collision, unlike the drivers who were killed in the crash. However, there is no doubt they played an integral part in this deadly chain of events, and investigators need to determine exactly how they were involved.
And it would seem a logical thing of, well, why keep the road closed and do all this investigation when, you could just go and talk to these people and they could tell you what happened. Well, experience tells us that people that are involved in crashes, let alone very serious crashes, they don't see everything that's happening there. So we have to do the investigation so we can try to get the physical evidence to speak to us.
So, Brad, how do you figure the SUV's tied into this whole wreck?
Well, I'm just looking at the damage here now to compare it with the transport truck. Just trying to determine whether this SUV hit the transport truck causing this unfortunate series of events, or whether it was the transport truck that hit the SUV and was the causational factor.
So the physical evidence here is going to give you the clues you need to really make sense out of this, huh?
I'm hoping that's what'll happen by comparing the damage.
Together with members of his team, Brad Muir is trying to turn back time in an effort to determine which vehicle was at fault. The answer to that question could have life-changing ramifications for one of these drivers. He needs to know what happened in the crucial seconds before the tractor-trailer lost control. Finding rubber transfer on the right front fender of the SUV, he hopes to match it with the left rear tires of the tractor-trailer. A careful comparison will tell him who hit who and when, and ultimately, which of these drivers initiated the crash. With the truck driver looking on, Brad's team makes a startling discovery. The rubber transfer on the SUV is higher off the ground than the truck tires themselves, meaning that the rear tires of the tractor-trailer were actually off the ground when they struck the SUV.
So you figured out how the SUV was involved in this now?
I have. The impact between the truck and the SUV was just down here where Mark is standing, and it all started right over here, where we first see the tire marks on the road, where the truck is in that hard left swerve.
So as the truck's going through here, we only see one set of tire marks, so there's some dynamics, the loading?
Yeah, as the truck swerved hard to the left, it's starting to tip over, leaning on its right side, which puts its left tires up in the air, and that's where the impact occurred between the truck and the SUV.
The tire marks show the truck was already out of control when it came into contact with the SUV. Investigators now know that Jeff Lee must have endured a few frightful seconds, unsure whether he or his wife would survive.
So you got the left side of the truck off the ground as it's starting to climb over the hood of the SUV. That must have been no fun for those guys.
Yeah, I would want to be him. He had no choice but to follow the truck right through the crash.
Roadway evidence has given investigators a crucial timetable of events leading up to the crash. They now know the truck began to fishtail first, its rear wheels becoming airborne and striking the fender of Jeff Lee's SUV. Helpless to regain control of his car, Lee is literally dragged into a scene of total destruction. Miraculously, he and his wife escape with their lives.
An 80,000-pound truck has swerved across 4 lanes of traffic, hit 3 cars, and killed 2 drivers. The at-scene evidence tells investigator Brad Muir that the truck lost control first. So Brad's going to have to focus on the activities of the driver, Bill Halliday. Now, Halliday's an experienced truck driver. Still in all, one of the things Brad will have to consider is that fatigue may have played a role in this crash.
Unfortunately, most of us don't realize how severely we can be affected by fatigue. You need 7 to 8 hours of sleep. Without it, reaction times can be tripled, lapses in attention and judgment. In fact, you can act as if you were legally drunk.
In his 20 years as a truck driver, Bill Halliday has enjoyed an impeccable safety record, until now. Immediately after the crash, he willingly accompanies the investigators to an interrogation conducted by a detective with the Ontario Provincial Police.
Well, I reported the terminal on my starting time, and I picked up my unit, did my pre-trip inspection. Then I left to make my deliveries. I made my first delivery. On my way to my second one on the highway, I heard a loud bang, and the vehicle swerved drastically to the left.
He testifies that right before the crash, he heard a loud bang.
This driver describes something happened very suddenly. Bang, it's all over with. But that's his perception. Sometimes perception is clouded by the events. In this case, he may have actually had something that happened very suddenly, and that is what he recognized happened. On the other hand, it may have been developing slowly over time, and he didn't notice it for some reason. He was tired, he was distracted, whatever it happened to be. Either way, it didn't leave him much time to react.
A driver suffering from fatigue could be startled by a collision with debris, a mechanical failure, or an engine backfiring, and suddenly lose control. And if the driver falls asleep, even for a moment, the results could be catastrophic.
So maybe we could have a look at your logbook.
However, diagnosing fatigue hours after the crash is almost impossible. Truck drivers are required to keep a detailed logbook. Their hours behind the wheel, rest stops, and meal breaks must all be accounted for. The logbook is a crucial piece of evidence for investigators trying to determine if fatigue is a factor. However, it's a source of frustration that some of the information police need is seldom documented.
When looking at a driver's logbook, it'll tell me their on-duty hours, which is essentially when they're around the truck, maybe while it's being loaded, their driving hours, their sleeper berth hours. But what it doesn't tell you is when they're off duty for, say, a couple of days before they're in to drive for their block, we don't know what they've done on those days. It doesn't tell us how much sleep he had the night before. It doesn't tell us how much sleep he's had in the last couple of days before. We don't know where he's been, what he's been doing. You know, he might have been very physically active in that period of time. We really don't know.
1 in 5 crashes are a result of driver fatigue. Someone tired behind the wheel. This thing called microsleep has the word micro in it. It sounds small, but it can have really big consequences. You're driving down the road, you doze off a little bit. 1 second at 60 miles an hour, that's 88 feet. You cover a lot of distance in a little bit of time. So as you can see, even a short period of time in what effectively would be a microsleep can be pretty devastating. This effect tends to be greater with novice drivers than experienced drivers, but both types have this lasting after effect, a fog, a haze, if you will, that may last for a little while. Microsleep is not a small problem, it can be a really big problem.
But after several days examining Halliday's driving routine and service records, investigators come up with nothing that suggests he was suffering from fatigue. He was in fact fully rested and had just begun his shift when disaster struck. Investigators are struggling to find a reason why an experienced driver would suddenly lose control of his trailer. Turning again to the driver's version of events, they begin a search for the source of the big bang that Bill Halliday says immediately preceded the disaster. They have no choice but to examine the entire truck piece by piece.
Well, we had Chris Foles, our forensic mechanic, look at the truck. It was logical to bring him into the investigation to try to look at the truck and see if he could find what caused the bang or may have contributed to or caused this crash. So he really has a good idea what separates mechanical wear or wearing out parts versus something abnormal from a breakage or metal fatigue or some other kind of failure or flaw in the manufacture of that part.
Yeah, we're going to start with the front because that's what controls basically the whole steering of the whole unit. Is done with the 2 front tires and the whole assembly at the front. So we're going to come up front and kind of rule this out. It's going to be a major part of the investigation. It's going to be the front end. So we want to make sure everything's intact and everything's working properly. So we start here with the spring assembly, the shackles, the U-bolts, make sure everything's intact and tight.
Chris Fold's expertise allows him to quickly narrow in on a fractured piece of metal connected to the truck's steering mechanism. He determines that the fracture was not the result of the crash, but actually occurred without warning just seconds before the driver lost control.
Chris did a lot of work combing through the whole front of that vehicle, and ultimately at the end of his investigation and his examination of the parts, the determination was that this piece of the steering, the drag link, had broken at the steering box. And when that happens, the driver essentially has a steering wheel in his hands that's useless. It doesn't afford him any marginal control. It gives him nothing. The front wheels are subject to steer in any direction that they want to go.
It wouldn't be caught by the driver on his circle check or a mechanic on an annual. Basically where this has failed is the inside of the output shaft, but unfortunately it's covered by the arm, so by a close examination you wouldn't be able to see it. It starts as a hairline crack and eventually gets moisture behind it, it rusts and leads to a failure. It's not something that can be seen, and it is a very rare type of failure.
Accident investigators use their expertise and resources to find the root causes of violent collisions so that injuries and deaths can be avoided in the future. When a mechanical failure is found to be the culprit, they routinely alert agencies that can order inspections or issue recalls. However, the failure in this case is so unique that it is unlikely to ever be seen again. For Brad Muir, this is the closest thing he has seen to a true accident, where no one is at fault.
There are very, very few crashes I've ever investigated that fit the definition of accident, and I suppose this is one that's probably the closest to that, because you have a driver driving a truck that appears to have been well maintained, conscientious driver in his inspections, and we have this crash, and it really seemed to be one of them that would come as close as you can to an accident.
With the inspection of the truck complete, investigators are now able to say exactly how this crash unfolded. Bill Halliday's tractor-trailer is southbound in the curb lane, while an SUV rides just off his rear wheels. Suddenly, the trailer starts to fishtail, eventually lifting its rear wheels off the ground. The wheels hit the SUV as the truck begins to cross into oncoming traffic. The truck plows into the first northbound car, instantly killing the driver. The driver in the second northbound car no doubt sees the catastrophe unfolding and slams on the brakes, but it fails to stop in time and he is pushed off the road. Neither of these drivers stood a chance against 80,000 pounds of metal. Brad was able to show that the SUV was initially struck by the truck and was dragged into oncoming traffic. The couple in the SUV miraculously survived, which left the driver of the truck facing blame. But in the end, his impeccable driving record remains unblemished. The crash was triggered by a mechanical fluke that was not the result of a manufacturer error or maintenance oversight. Every year, violent collisions kill 3,000 Canadians and injure another 200,000. But there is no such thing as an accident. Every collision has a story as unique as the people involved. Rusty Haight is a leading authority on accident reconstruction. He trains investigators around the world to read the clues and solve the mysteries.
This truck's a mess. It's rolled over, it's been hit once, probably twice on the side. Can you imagine what it was like inside this truck for the occupants? Well, somebody has to, and that person's studying occupant kinematics. Now, occupant kinematics is all about how people move inside a car. We can use it to analyze seatbelt issues, airbag issues. Now, sometimes it can come into play in more mysterious cases, where even the very nature of the crash is a question.
It's after midnight on an empty stretch of road when a woman notices a man frantically trying to flag her down. She is a little reluctant to stop, but as she draws closer, she can hear the man pleading for help. The man tells her that his car has gone off the side of the road into the river, with his elderly mother still inside. Within minutes, a local trooper arrives on the scene.
He's down there, down there. Where?
But by the time they get back down to the car, the body is nowhere to be found.
He said that he'd spent some 15 or 20 minutes swimming up and down, searching for his mother, trying to get her out of the car.
Please, somebody, as soon as possible.
The man identifies himself as Anthony Salter. At the time of the accident, his elderly mother had recently undergone hip replacement surgery, and Anthony decided to move back into her house to take care of her. When he tells the police about his failed attempt to save his mother, the officer is impressed by his calm behavior and ability to recall all of the details of the incident. At the hospital, a routine checkup shows that Anthony hasn't suffered a single injury from the crash. The doctor is surprised by these findings, and the escorting officer decides to take photos of the examination. The next day, Anthony receives terrible news from the police. Earlier that morning, his mother's body was found washed up on the riverbank. On first blush, Marion Salter's death appears to be a tragic accident. But 2 weeks after the crash, District Attorney Rick Esser receives information that puts a doubt in his mind.
The first phone call that was of great benefit to the investigation was one from an insurance agent.
The agent explains to the DA that Anthony had recently increased his mother's life insurance policy and that he seemed desperate to get his hands on the money. From that moment, Rick decides to completely re-examine the dynamics of the crash.
While we had our doubts about the defendant's story, we wanted to see if the laws of physics demonstrated that is this person a valid suspect or is this likely an accident? That's why we had Joe Hancock get involved.
Crash reconstructionist Joe Hancock usually works in another jurisdiction, but he is quickly identified as the best man for the job.
They wouldn't waste my time, and I wouldn't waste their time. For them to call me at the scene, I knew it had to be a complex case and that it would take a great deal of investigation.
Joe is a specialist among specialists. His field of expertise studies the body's movement inside a vehicle during a crash, a science called occupant kinematics.
In the information that I received from Mr. Esser was that Anthony had advised the investigators that he was driving his mother home from a bridge game. She had just recently had a hip operation and she was under medication. But as they were traveling down the road, he was traveling approximately about 70 miles per hour when he must have fallen asleep. And when he fell asleep, he drifted off the road and he did not wake up until his vehicle was just entering the water.
When Joe begins his reconstruction, 2 weeks have already passed since the accident. Thankfully, local authorities have done a thorough job documenting the scene. To determine whether or not the crash was really an accident, Joe has to analyze the 3 most important factors in occupant kinematics: the crash scene, the vehicle, and the occupant's injuries.
One of the things that Mr. Esser did was show me photographs taken very recently after the crash of Mr. Salter. And immediately I saw that this person had no marks at all on his chest or upper body.
Joe suspects that this photograph might be a highly valuable source of information, but he can't make any assumptions without first looking at the other elements of the crash.
I needed to see the scene.
Hello.
Joe heads over to the crash site with the investigator who first mapped the scene. Detective Eddie Verdon shows Joe where Salter claims his car went airborne and jumped into the water at around 110 kilometers per hour.
Looking at the tire tracks and looking at the scene, my experience told me already that this did not happen the way Anthony had described. First of all, if a vehicle did go off a cliff at 70 miles per hour, the vehicle would have almost cleared the river completely and landed on the other side.
But Detective Verdon informs Joe that the vehicle was found in the water only 5 meters from the shoreline. Both men agree on one thing: the car had to be traveling at a much slower speed than Salter claimed.
Now, of course, that does not mean that he is lying. He has been involved in a traumatic crash. He has lost his mother. He could have a hard time remembering correctly. My job is to not really dwell too much of what Anthony said, but what does the physical evidence tell me?
Joe's next stop is the embankment. At the base of the cliff, he can easily see where the vehicle left the cliff and came down. Then, on the edge of the shoreline, hidden between the rocks, Joe makes an amazing discovery.
I noticed that there was debris from a vehicle still in the rocks. I then identified a headlamp assembly, some molding from the luggage rack, and an antenna from a motor vehicle.
This unexpected find sheds a whole new light on Joe's investigation.
Seeing that, I knew that this vehicle did not actually hit water first, but it hit the base of the cliff first. This area at the base of the cliff was roughly about 7 to 8 feet from the base of the cliff, so the vehicle went off at a very low speed.
This clearly disproves Anthony's recollection of the speed he was traveling, but it still does not contradict his basic version of events. it's entirely possible that the car simply slowed before plunging off the cliff.
We were able to determine that the vehicle left the cliff roughly about 19 miles per hour and hit the bottom of the cliff at 22 miles per hour.
Meanwhile, at the DA's office, Rick Esser receives a phone call from a woman introducing herself as Marion Salter's former private nurse. Mary Ross says she decided to call the DA after she learned about Marion's death in the newspaper. She informs Rick that Anthony had let her go a few months earlier, saying that he couldn't afford her services anymore.
Good afternoon.
According to Ross, Anthony kept complaining that the costs related to his mother's condition were forcing him to postpone his own retirement. A woman suffers a horrible death when the car she and her son are traveling in drives off the road into a river. Clues at the crash site and interviews with family members have led investigators to suspect her son's version of events. But so far, there is little concrete evidence that would suggest any wrongdoing.
Even if he's lying, does not mean there's anything else about this crash, but I need to do a complete reconstruction.
Then, the autopsy reports come in with shocking findings. While confirming that the victim died from drowning, it also shows that there were abnormally high levels of sedatives in her blood.
Well, when I saw the amount of medication in her system, I then understood that she was basically passed out. She was quite asleep and anything could have happened.
This information is a major break in the investigation. While Anthony's mother was taking pain medication for her injured hip, the levels were far beyond the prescribed amount, suggesting that someone may have tampered with her dosage in order to render her unconscious. But despite mounting evidence of foul play, the only thing that can prove it one way or the other are the kinematics of the crash itself. The next step is to analyze the damage to the vehicle.
As I approached the front of the car, I did notice that there was severe front-end damage. It's starting to confirm for me that the vehicle hit nose first.
On the right front of the car, one headlight assembly is missing, while the one on the left-hand side identically matches the model Joe found on the embankment.
I then noticed that the antenna fit into the receptacle for the antenna. And I also noticed that the weather stripping for the roof rack did match up to the crashed vehicle.
Joe next turns his attention to the numerous scratches and bumps found on the car. For this veteran accident investigator, reading those marks is like reading a book. And soon Joe is able to precisely reconstruct the dynamics of the crash.
Well, I also noticed in my observations of the car scrape marks that were in a circular pattern. So it does confirm to me that the vehicle hit nose first, pivoted on the nose, and fell on the driver's side of the car. And then the scrape marks all along the side, the driver's side, well, that tells me that the vehicle then slid into the water.
At this point, Joe knows how the crash occurred. But in order to reconstruct the truth, he will need to determine exactly how this squares with the injuries to the occupants. And this is where Marion Salter's autopsy report might be the key.
I saw that Marion had bruisings on both her left and right knees. She had bruises along the shin of her right leg. I then can match those up to contact points in the car. Here and here.
On the passenger side of the car, the history of Marion Salter's final moments is clearly written.
So it looks like her knees came in and hit the dash here. That the ashtray is broken.
All the marks that Joe finds on the passenger side are consistent with Marion's exact injuries. They also indicate that the victim was not wearing a seatbelt. But Joe suspects that the final clue may lay on the driver's side. Since he saw that photograph of Anthony's unharmed chest, Joe has been mystified as to how he could survive an accident of this magnitude virtually unscathed. This is the crux of the entire investigation. If he can prove that Salter was not in the vehicle at the time of the crash, it will be enough to bring charges against him.
If he's not belted in the car, this is what should have happened. He should have hit the steering wheel like a person falling off a two-story building. You would have seen contact points of his body against the steering wheel in the column. We did not see that.
The absence of marks shows that Anthony Salter was certainly not driving this car unbelted when it went over the cliff. But Joe still has to rule out one last possibility that could be raised in Salter's defense. What if Anthony was actually wearing his seatbelt?
So in this case, we don't have any marking from a body on the dash or the steering wheel. Now, in a lower speed crash with the seatbelts, that's what seatbelts are for, and so it should be preventing that kind of contact. But that's going to leave some sort of marks on the body where the belts come across your ribs and across your waist. What we're going to do is an experiment here with the belts and the dummy. We're going to go ahead and take this belt, and we're going to put chalk on it to show where it would mark what's called the D-ring here. And we're going to also have the belt across the dummy and see how he loads that belt in the crash. Let's see how my buddy the dummy did. Okay, so let's see how my buddy the dummy made out. We're gonna look at the belts, and you can see where the belt actually made contact. You'll see it in the footage. There's a mark on the chest and on the stomach here. And then at the point, and this is exactly right, at the point where the belt went through the D-ring, you can see where it scraped away some of the chalk, and there's actually a little blur, a little smear mark there. That's from the body loading a belt. That's what we expect to see when we have a driver.
In Anthony Salter's car, the driver's seatbelt is still in perfect condition. And with this photo that was taken on the night of the crash, Joe was able to prove that Anthony didn't sustain any bruising.
If he was belted in the car, he should have had these bruises across his shoulder. That did not occur.
We had such a mountain of evidence against him, we decided to place him under arrest. We had no doubt that he was going to be convicted.
During Anthony Salter's trial, Joe Hancock reconstructs his version of the crash for the jury. He leads them step by step through the sordid details of Anthony's intricate plan to murder his mother.
A staged criminal act had taken place.
Late one night, Anthony Salter is driving his 81-year-old mother home from her weekly game of bridge. He most likely offers her a drink that he's heavily spiked with sedative, and within minutes she is asleep. Anthony is familiar with the road and knows the exact moment to pull off where the ground begins to slope toward the small river. He stops just long enough to get out of the car, leaves it in gear, and then watches as the vehicle begins to roll. The car falls over the cliff and hits the embankment, twisting and toppling into the water. As the car slowly sinks out of view with his mother trapped inside, Anthony scrambles down the embankment and splashes muddy water on himself. A few minutes later, he is flagging down a passing motorist for help.
Joe's accident reconstruction was the pièce de résistance, if you want to call it. It's hard to refute the laws of physics.
The jury is quickly convinced, and Anthony Salter is sentenced to life in prison for the premeditated murder of his mother.
In car crashes, body movements occur in a split second, literally in the blink of an eye. Did you see where the dummy was in this crash? Did you see how close it got to the steering wheel when the airbag deployed? In a crash test like that, high-speed cameras can document a sequence happening too fast for the human eye. But in the field, there's no high-speed cameras. It's up to the accident investigator to use good observations and make the right deductions, particularly in occupant ejection cases where you're trying to figure out who might have been driving.
It's early on an ordinary Monday morning, and two kids are taking a shortcut on their way to school. But as they move through a densely weeded area, they spot something in the brush that turns out to be anything but ordinary. Minutes later, police secure the scene of a fatal car accident. A vehicle is flipped on its side in a ravine with one man pinned down underneath. Leading this investigation is crash reconstructionist Tom Stoley.
My main role is to gather facts, information, evidence to determine all of the elements surrounding this particular crash. We had a victim that was underneath the car. Was there anybody else in the car? Were they the sole occupant of the car? Who was driving?
As officers search the area for other ejected occupants, Tom notices the overgrown weeds and realizes that the car is barely visible from the roadway.
The first thing that struck my mind was, how long had this been there? It could have been hours, it could have been days.
A paramedic confirms that the man is dead and has been probably for a few hours. But taking the corpse away at this stage could potentially disturb crucial evidence.
I decided to keep the body in place until we had a chance to really go over the scene and gather everything we could.
There are several items strewn around the site. A couple of empty beer bottles and unopened packs of cigarettes litter the area. Further up the ravine, a baseball cap has also been thrown from the car. Inside the vehicle, the contents of a wallet are spread out, and police quickly find a license that reveals the identity of the victim. The name Alex Trevino is well known to the police. He lives with his uncle, Gene Mitchell, and their home is regularly visited by officers answering calls related to public disturbances and drunken brawling. Alex and Gene are rarely seen without each other, and around town everyone knows who they are. The car is licensed to Gene, but a quick check shows that Alex is registered as a second driver. As police try to contact Gene Mitchell, Tom directs his attention to the physical evidence on the roadway. Analyzing a pair of tread marks left on the asphalt, he is able to visualize the events leading up to the crash.
As it enters the curve, it goes into a side skid. It's rotating. It's where the rear tire crosses over the path of the front tire. That's why they get wider here.
Such traces of rotating motion lead Tom to one conclusion. The car entered the curve traveling way too fast.
Every curve, every bend in the roadway has what's called a critical curve speed. Now that's a speed that you can't go faster than and still stay on the curve. Now if we know the radius of the turn and something about how sticky the road is, friction, we can actually calculate that speed. So what we want to do is stay inside of that speed. Now we're going to do an experiment here. I'm going to drive through this curve to show how fast we can go and still stay on the curve. So there it is. It doesn't take more than about 5 miles an hour over that critical curve speed, and you're out of control. Those yellow signs, they're there for a reason. Someone's already done the calculation for you. Follow the direction.
Obviously, the driver who caused these tire marks wasn't following directions at all.
I was able to determine the speed of the vehicle, and it was in the neighborhood of 61, 62 miles per hour. More than 30 miles per hour, the speed limit.
It's also clear that in order to shear off a utility pole like that, there had to have been a massive impact. As an accident investigator, Tom's role is to make sure that every aspect of the crash matches up with his observations. The car's left front and back wheel rims are broken, probably due to it sliding sideways. And the damage at the rear end of the vehicle is consistent with slamming into the utility pole. But as Tom finally authorizes the removal of the victim's body from the scene, he is surprised to see that Alex's body shows no sign of injury.
It was fairly undamaged for this type of collision.
Tom then receives confirmation that no other victims, dead or alive, have been found in the surrounding area. Naturally, this would suggest that Alex was traveling alone and that he was the one driving the vehicle. But Tom has his doubts.
Well, one of the first things that drew my attention was the victim was clutching a pack of cigarettes in his hand. And the driver was trying to steer through the curve, trying to steer back onto the roadway. How do you do that with a pack of cigarettes in your hand?
Tom has a growing suspicion that someone else was driving the vehicle. He requests an immediate check on the crash victims recently admitted to nearby hospitals and starts looking for clues that may suggest there was a second occupant in the car.
I think there's somebody else.
Studying the new pack of cigarettes more closely, Tom wonders if it may have been purchased just moments before the crash.
It appeared to be a fresh pack of cigarettes, like he was in the process of opening them at the time.
Following his instincts, Tom decides to check out a convenience store located just half a mile from the scene, on the exact same road the car was coming from.
That would seem like a logical spot that they may have stopped to purchase these cigarettes.
In an amazing twist, the store clerk tells Tom that Alex Trevino had indeed been in the store earlier to buy cigarettes. And he was not alone. Screening the surveillance camera footage, Tom is able to locate an image showing that Alex Trevino walked into the store with another man. The clerk knows them both well. He identifies Alex's companion as his uncle and buddy, Gene Mitchell.
It was a great piece of evidence because it puts them together just before the crash. And the other important piece of information in the video was Gene Mitchell's wearing a baseball cap.
A baseball cap identical to the one Tom found on the crash scene.
It places Gene Mitchell at the scene and also helps pinpoint the time of the crash.
With this new piece of evidence, Tom knows that a few minutes after 4:42 that morning, Gene Mitchell was riding with his nephew, Alex Trevino, when their vehicle violently left the road due to excessive speed. His next task will be to determine who was driving. And since alcohol seems to be involved, the answer to that question could lead to serious consequences for the surviving victim. Investigator Tom Stoley has just discovered that an accident victim found dead on the roadside earlier that morning was actually traveling with his uncle just moments before the crash. But the uncle is nowhere to be found. On his way back to the police station, Tom receives a call from dispatch. He learns that Gene Mitchell has been admitted to a hospital just a few miles from the crash site and is being treated for multiple injuries, including what police call road rash. Tom requests that a blood sample be taken from the suspect and rushes to the hospital.
I want to get the blood as soon as possible.
Road rash is a term that we use in medicine to describe an abrasion. Oftentimes when someone falls on asphalt, they fall off a bicycle, they get ejected from a motor vehicle accident, you will see the skin abraded. Road rash is something that we see very, very frequently.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Investigator Stoley. I'm here to meet with one of my
Oh,
colleagues.
yeah, just right there.
At the ER entrance desk, Tom meets with a patrolling officer who tells him that he'd found the suspect about an hour before.
Hey, stop!
Mitchell had been shirtless and obviously intoxicated, yelling and wandering in the middle of the street. When the responding officer went to talk to him, he quickly noticed severe abrasions across the left side of Mitchell's head, leg, arm, and chest.
He claimed that he had been the victim of an assault. He had been beaten up by one or two other people.
Mitchell's wounds did not appear consistent with this type of assault. There were no bruises or similar injuries you'd expect to result from an attack. But the injuries were serious enough for the officer to take Mitchell to the hospital. Next, Tom interviews the ER physician handling Gene Mitchell's case. Dr. Bill Marciano tells him that both of his patient's clavicles are fractured. Mitchell also has 6 broken ribs, a punctured spleen, a collapsed and contused left lung, and many cuts and scrapes.
They were substantial injuries. Most of them were localized to the left side of his body. They were clearly not injuries from an assault. They were definitely from some car crash.
Injury analysis is a key element in accident reconstruction. And as the doctor enumerates Mitchell's injuries, Tom continues the reconstruction of the crash in the same way as you would build a brick wall, piece by piece.
The way the vehicle left the roadway, one of the first things it did was impacted a utility pole near the left rear of the car. And it would be reasonable that the person sitting in the driver's seat would be slammed against the left side of the car and sustain some fairly major injuries on their left side. That would account for the broken ribs on the left side, the ruptured spleen, and the various other internal type injuries he received. Yeah, certainly.
Gene Mitchell's blood test results confirm that he was highly intoxicated on his arrival at the hospital. If Tom is able to prove that he was behind the wheel at the time of the crash, Mitchell will certainly be facing some serious criminal charges. Dr. Marciano understands the situation and he authorizes Tom to interrogate his patient.
When I spoke to Gene, he gave a couple of conflicting versions of the cause of his injuries and his whereabouts that night. Finally, he did admit that he was with Alex Trevino and that he was in the vehicle. However, he wouldn't say that he was driving. He stated that Alex was driving.
All the physical evidence so far suggests that Mitchell may be lying. But Tom knows that if the case goes to court, he will need all aspects of the crash scene to match up with his reconstruction. And one mystery remains. Why would Alex Trevino's body suffer so little damage in the accident? Back at the scene, Tom starts looking for physical evidence that may help him put that last brick in the wall.
The driver's side window is broken. All the other window glass is intact. The passenger would have had to been ejected out the driver's side window, as well as the driver.
This single observation solves the mystery of Alex's undamaged body and allows Tom to finalize his reconstruction of the events that led to Alex Trevino's untimely death. In the middle of the night, Gene Mitchell is driving back home from a bar with his nephew Alex Trevino. Severely intoxicated, Gene's reflexes are highly affected, and his car enters a curve at more than 50 kilometers per hour faster than the curve's critical speed limit. Unable to complete the turn, the vehicle skids to the left side of the road and hits a utility pole before it starts overturning in grassy terrain. Gene Mitchell is crushed up against the left side of the car, and his body absorbs all the violent impact. In the process, he acts as a virtual shield protecting Alex Trevino from any bodily harm. After the first roll, Mitchell's body is propelled through the driver's side window and lands violently on the ground. But by the time Alex passes through the already broken window, the car has lost some of its momentum, and he lands softly on the long weeds. Unfortunately, a moment later, the car rolls on top of him, squeezing his body into the spongy turf.
The cause of death was positional asphyxia.
Positional asphyxia occurs when the patient can't get oxygen into his lungs. Sometimes that is due to a heavy object on the chest, so the lungs can't expand.
The autopsy later reveals that Alex Trevino suffered only 2 broken ribs and would have easily survived the crash if the vehicle had not rolled on top of him. Gene Mitchell pleads guilty to criminal vehicular operation, resulting in the death of Alex Trevino. He was sentenced to 4 years confinement plus 5 years probation.
The human condition often plays a role in crashes. For younger drivers, we perceive them to be reckless, inexperienced, driving too fast. It's a fact of life for those of us aging. We know our eyesight isn't what it used to be and our reaction time has slowed down a little bit. Now, any one of these factors can play a role in a crash. Today, it's Frank Carson's job to figure out if one did.
On a hot, muggy afternoon, Jane Balfour is busy working in her garden when the sudden sound of metal hitting metal jars her out of her thoughts. She looks up just in time to see a vehicle sideswipe the neighbor's car and continue on down the street towards a parking lot. Jane rushes back into the house and calls 911. When she comes back out, she sees that the car has actually come to a stop, but not before having hit a pedestrian. A passing jogger stops to help the injured woman while Jane checks on the driver of the car.
Okay. My name is Jane.
He's an older man, and while he doesn't seem to have any external injuries, he's only semi-conscious and his breathing is slow. Medics arrive on the scene within minutes and rush both individuals to the hospital. Frank Carson, traffic reconstructionist, is called in to head up the investigation.
After the officer briefed me, I started looking around, and the only thing I could see was the driver's car hit a parked car. They were still stuck together. Garbage can had been knocked over, and of course the area where the pedestrian had fallen down after she had gotten hit. And that's all I had to go on at that point.
Frank's job is a difficult one. He will need to determine exactly why this car left the road and hit the passing pedestrian. His findings could have serious ramifications for the driver, victim, and their families. As a first step, he runs a check on the car's registration, and the owner is identified as Mr. Harold Carlisle, a 68-year-old local man.
He's over there.
Frank then turns his attention to the crash site.
I went back down the road from the direction that it looked like his car came to look for other marks on the roadway.
But there is no roadway evidence of skidding or any other signs of braking.
What I found astonishing about this crash is the car had traveled such a long distance without any input from the driver.
Frank measures over 170 meters of the driverless tire marks.
The car went a long distance, so he had to have been traveling at a pretty decent speed. It's a 25-mile-an-hour zone. And we were able to calculate from the marks on the roadway and other evidence that he was probably going at least 50 miles an hour at the beginning of this whole scenario to be able to travel that far, hit the curbs, hit the pedestrian, and still have enough energy to hit a parked car.
Frank's at a loss. He can't begin to explain the bizarre crash. There's just no evidence to give him a clue as to what might have happened here.
So in a crash like this, you start thinking about different scenarios, how the crash could have occurred, what may have caused it. Was there a mechanical problem with the car? And the other possibility is he may have done what some people do and confuse the brake pedal with the gas pedal.
Accident investigators find themselves working on cases where the driver has mistaken the brake and the accelerator pedal. May seem surprising, but it happens, and it can lead to disastrous results. Can you imagine being on the freeway and a big truck in front of you slowing, and instead of going for the brake, you go for the accelerator? That's not a good thing. Now, a lot of times when this happens is you find a certain type of tire mark, an acceleration scuff, and accident investigators are trained to identify that. It's different than a braking tire mark. But here, Frank doesn't have either. So what's he going to do? How's he going to solve this case?
The vehicle also shows no damage that would suggest Carlisle had been run off the road or involved in an earlier collision. Next, Frank requests that the car be taken back to the garage for a full forensic inspection.
So the scene information and what the witnesses told me didn't help a lot to answer some of the questions we had. We have a car that's out of control, and we have a pedestrian. And did the pedestrian maybe accidentally step in front of the car? That's something we don't know about right now. And the best way to find that out is going to be to go to the hospital and talk to Mr. Carlisle, see what he might remember.
The case is starting to rely heavily on Stephanie Platt and Harold Carlisle. Mr. Harold Carlisle, a 68-year-old man, is involved in a dramatic accident when he loses control of his vehicle and hits Stephanie Platt. Both Mrs. Platt and Mr. Carlisle are rushed to the emergency room. Accident reconstructionist Frank Carson is heading up the investigation. Testimonies and physical evidence show Mr. Carlisle's car left the road, but it appears that he never tried to regain control before slamming into Mrs. Platt.
So while I'm driving the hospital, I have a couple scenarios to run through my head. What happened to Mr. Carlisle to make him do this? Was he maybe impaired by drugs or alcohol? Did he have kind of medical crisis? Or maybe he passed out?
Or could a mechanical failure have caused the crash? Frank hopes to speak with Harold and Stephanie, the only two people who know exactly what happened. But when Frank finally arrives at the hospital, neither patient is in any condition to talk. Harold Carlisle has been heavily sedated, his body having gone into shock, and Stephanie Platt is still in the operating room undergoing surgery to save her life. Her leg was so severely injured by the impact that it had to be amputated, and her other internal injuries are massive. She suffered serious blunt force trauma.
Blunt force trauma at moderate to high speed is a very dangerous situation for the patient. The risk of serious injury goes up astronomically. You assume very serious injury in multiple organ systems.
The doctors have been able to run a routine blood test on Harold Carlisle, and the results come back negative for alcohol, another dead end. But as Frank turns to leave the hospital, he is flagged down by Tom Carlisle, Harold's son. Tom tells Frank that he'd been expecting his father that evening for dinner. When he hadn't shown up, he tried calling and eventually drove over to his dad's house. He was surprised to find the Meals on Wheels service breakfast still in the bag and untouched on the kitchen table. Frank asks Tom whether his dad was on any medication or suffered from any medical problems. Tom then reveals a very important fact. His father is an epileptic.
You know, when I think of somebody having a seizure, I think of a little thunderstorm inside the brain. You have all these little electrical impulses like popcorn going off in the brain, but they're all going down the pathway, different pathways all over to get from your brain down to your eyes, to your ears, to your mouth, down to your legs, your arms. And what happens with a seizure is there's an abnormal electrical impulse in the brain, like a spark. And all of a sudden, that spark can trigger other sparks.
Frank learns that Harold Carlisle had been on the same prescription drugs for about 15 years, and as far as Tom knows, has never suffered any side effects.
Tom didn't know the type of medication, but he was able to give me an important clue. He gave me the personal physician, Mr. Carlisle, so that's a person I can follow up with and get a little more detail out of.
Frank gets a call from dispatch reporting that the mechanical inspection revealed no faults or problems with the car, and the only significant damage was sustained in the final collision. While the crash scene evidence has now been exhausted, the medical lead is all Frank has left. His next stop is Harold's personal physician, Dr. Bronson. Dr. Bronson confirms that she met with Mr. Carlisle only a month before to check on his medication. Mr. Carlisle indicated that he hadn't been suffering from any seizures or side effects. She is certain the medication would prevent him from having a seizure, provided he'd been taking the prescribed dosage. That's the next question Frank has to answer.
You have to be very careful if you are self-medicating. And the reason for that is missing a dose of medication may be just as serious as taking too much of the medication. And when you're doing that and you get behind the wheel of a car, then you may put yourself at risk, but more often, you may put others at risk.
Frank recalls a snippet from the conversation he'd had with Tom Carlisle about the Meals on Wheels breakfast sitting untouched on the kitchen table. According to Tom, his father always took his medicine along with his first meal of the day.
The morning of the accident, his father hadn't eaten his breakfast. So there's a possibility that since he didn't eat his breakfast, he didn't take his medicine like he was supposed to.
Frank immediately calls the hospital and speaks to the ER doctor. He asks that the blood test include the level of anti-seizure meds in Harold Carlisle's system.
The blood test results could show something very important. If Mr. Carlisle's level of his medication, his bloodstream was too low or non-existent, he could have had a blackout.
The next morning, Frank returns to the hospital. He's advised that Mr. Carlisle is coming around and is now alert enough to be interviewed.
I asked him what I asked most people involved in accidents. Do you remember anything about the crash?
Can you tell me what happened?
Well, the last thing he remembers was hitting a curb or a bump. Next thing he remembers, he's sitting in his car, someone's knocking on the window, and they're putting a mask on his face, and the EMS personnel are there to treat him.
Frank is astonished. Harold Carlisle doesn't remember anything about the crash or the moments leading up to it. That means his car was traveling driverless for a period of time at roughly 80 kilometers an hour. Again, this information fits with the possibility of a seizure, but Frank needs more information.
And I asked him if he remembers the morning, if he had his breakfast. And after saying he didn't remember, he admitted that no, he didn't eat his breakfast. And then I asked him if there's a possibility maybe he didn't take his medication, because he usually takes with his breakfast. And after talking about that for a moment, he finally admitted that no, he didn't take his medication that morning like he was supposed to.
The blood test confirms Mr. Carlisle's admission. The level of anti-seizure meds suggests a period of approximately 12 to 16 hours without medication. Harold Carlisle goes on to admit that he often didn't take his medications as prescribed. Rather, he took them according to his own schedule. This is not the first time that Frank has heard such a confession. He used to be a medic and isn't surprised.
On long-term medication, you're supposed to maintain a therapeutic level of the drug in your system to manage your condition. And if you take your medication on a regular basis, your medication levels go up and down, just like a roller coaster. And that's not a good way to manage your medical condition.
Tragically, Harold Carlisle's failure to adhere to his dosage requirements costs Stephanie Platt her life. Doctors are simply unable to repair damage to her spleen and liver, and Stephanie Platt dies 24 hours after arriving at the hospital.
This is a sad case for the family, certainly of Miss Platt, who was killed in the crash, but also for Mr. Carlisle. He's going through his life managing his condition without knowing that the way he is managing it, by not taking medication properly, could cause a problem like this.
With the final piece of the puzzle in place, Frank can now recreate the tragic events that led to a young woman's untimely death. After failing to take his medication that morning, 68-year-old Harold Carlisle suffers an epileptic seizure and blacks out behind the wheel. His car careens out of control, hops a curb, and slams into pedestrian Stephanie Platt. The violent force of the collision causes massive internal injuries that ultimately claim her life. Frank meets with the state attorney's office to review the case and decide what, if any, charges will be brought against Harold Carlisle.
I met with the state's attorney's office to review the case, and Mr. Carlisle could have been facing motor vehicle manslaughter charges, But because of the circumstance of the case, it was decided not to prosecute him criminally, and Ms. Platt's family decided not to pursue any civil litigation.
Every year, violent collisions kill 3,000 Canadians and injure another 200,000. But there is no such thing as an accident. Every collision has a story as unique as the people involved. Rusty Haight is a leading authority on accident reconstruction. He trains investigators around the world to read the clues and solve the mysteries.
You can be driving carefully, the road clear, the weather perfect. But you can still be involved in a collision. The other guy doesn't do something he is supposed to do, or does something he isn't supposed to do. You can still be in a crash. Now, there are a lot of things you can do to avoid a collision. First among those is to drive defensively and anticipate problem situations.
On a beautiful May afternoon, Laura Smith, a single mother, is taking her son Jason to his grandparents' summer house for the week. It's only an hour's drive from home. The day looks perfect for a relaxed trip out of town and a swim in the lake. Then, seemingly out of the blue, a motorhome in front of her brakes hard. Laura has no choice but to brake also. Meanwhile, a bus driving behind Laura is coming up fast and desperately trying to keep from slamming into her, but to no avail. Laura's small passenger car folds up like an accordion between the two large vehicles and immediately bursts into flames. Firefighters arrive on the scene and do their best to extinguish the blaze, but it's too late for Laura and her son. Despite the fact that it's his day off, accident investigator Don Carroll is called in by his supervisor.
It must have been a major accident for me to be called off duty to respond to the scene.
The scene is one of the worst Don has ever seen. The small passenger car is still sandwiched between the two larger vehicles and has been burnt down to its chassis. Don also learns that both mother and son have been confirmed dead. Although investigators may be used to dealing with the gruesome task of road accidents, the sight of the burnt bodies is devastating.
It's always tough when I respond to accidents such as this because I have several small children of my own, and anytime a child is involved in a crash, and in this case burned so horribly, it's very tough.
It's now Don's task to find out exactly why and how this terrible accident occurred. At the scene, he has 3 vehicles involved in the collision. Determining what part each of the drivers played in this tragedy is the first step.
I saw that the driver of the motorhome appeared to be in shock, so I decided to go to the bus driver, Miss Albright.
You okay?
I'm okay.
Monica Albright explains to Don that traffic was moving smoothly until out of the blue, the motorhome appeared to decelerate rapidly, forcing both Laura and her to brake sharply. She tried to stop in time, but just couldn't.
When I heard Miss Albright's statement, I was first thinking that maybe she was following the small passenger car too closely, and that's why she wasn't able to stop. But I also considered that something happened with the motorhome. Maybe an animal ran out in front of the car. Maybe the motorhome had a mechanical problem.
Next, a patrol officer informs Don that Mr. Peterson is ready to make his statement.
Mr. Peterson told me that a small red car passed him quickly on the left side, directly in front of his motorhome, and then started to drive more slowly. And then for no reason, the car slammed on its brakes.
Peterson insists to Don that he reacted quickly but couldn't manage to steer clear and hit the red car lightly from the rear. He thought he had avoided the worst, but a second later, he felt the impact of Laura's car from behind. He claims that the errant car stayed in front of him maybe a few seconds, but then the driver accelerated and disappeared.
When I heard Mr. Peterson's story about the red car that the other driver didn't report to me at all, I thought at first that maybe Mr. Peterson may not have been telling me the truth about it. So I knew I had to go look for damage on the front of the motorhome.
Found this basically yellow and black
transfer marks. I'm not sure what it's from, but it's not something I would expect to find on this pristine bumper. There's some indentations on the bumper like it hit another vehicle, but these yellow and black transfer marks are very suspect and possibly from another vehicle.
Don moves on to the scene investigation, looking for any other clue to confirm the presence of the mysterious fleeing car. The road is a mess of debris, but there's also a lot of skid marks, which is no surprise in a pileup like this.
Miss Albright told me it was like a domino effect, where the motorhome braked, the small passenger car braked, and then she had to brake. There was no advance warning.
Then Don picks up another clue. Just ahead of the motorhome, he notices 4 sets of skid marks. A quick look clearly tells him that these marks are still hot and that they don't belong to any of the other vehicles involved.
I thought that there definitely was a 4th vehicle involved, and then I contacted my dispatch center, who put out a be on the lookout broadcast to look for this vehicle that was involved in this crash.
If another car participated in the chain of events that led to the fiery deaths of Laura and Jason, why did he or she flee the scene? And what caused the accident to happen in the first place? The road evidence and Mr. Peterson's testimony lead Don to consider a brand new theory about the accident.
I thought there was a possibility that this may be an actual staged accident that occurred, because this type of accident fits the profile.
Every year in California alone, there's some $200 million in fraud perpetrated as a function of stage crashes. These aren't accidents, these are intentional events. What you got is a criminal that'll drive around and pull in front of a commercial vehicle or an expensive car, someone that looks like they have insurance. They'll stop suddenly, they'll get rear-ended. Now what you got is everyone in the rear-ended car is injured. They'll bring together a group of doctors and lawyers and, of course, witnesses who'll make this a very multidisciplinary, a multi-jurisdictional effort. That's what makes this such a difficult case to prosecute.
A terrible accident on a busy roadway has claimed the lives of Laura Smith and her 5-year-old son, Jason. Investigator Don Carroll has been brought in to reconstruct the chain of events that led to their deaths. As a next step, Don requests a full mechanical examination of all the vehicles. But his priority is to find the red car that reportedly fled the scene of the accident.
This type of accident fits the profile, in which case a car slams on its brakes in front of a very expensive vehicle, either a commercial vehicle or a motorhome, a luxurious motorhome, because that is where there's deep pockets, where there's a lot of insurance money that's possible available to them to collect.
To follow up on the criminal angle, Don turns to an old colleague, Marty Gonzalez, chief investigator with the California Insurance Fraud Department.
Stage collisions are very prevalent, not only here in California and in the Los Angeles area, but in a lot of states all over the United States. And the reason they're done is, bottom line, is money.
But even if Marty's sure that this is a staged accident, he also knows how hard it will be to prove it.
Basically, the way they work is there's a person, commonly known as a stager, who has an in with a lawyer or a doctor, typically the lawyer, and this lawyer will pay this person to bring them cases. The stager's job is to go out and plan these accidents and recruit people who are willing to participate and be in the car when it's going to get hit at 60, 70 miles an hour by another car, or by a large truck or a big rig. And they go out and they plan the accidents.
While Marty investigates possible criminal rings having links with staged accidents, Don receives the mechanical report. The examination of each vehicle involved in the crash shows nothing unusual. The same day, the autopsy report also comes in. Even for the 2 veterans, the details are extremely disturbing.
When I attended the autopsy, the medical examiner told me that the mom and the child did not die as a result of being hit in the rear by the bus. They died as a result of the fire that erupted after the crash. And the medical examiner told me that because there was still basically soot inside the trachea, which means that they were trying to breathe, And I was hopeful that it was an instantaneous event, but in this case, it was not.
Typically, there are three problems. One is that the amount of oxygen in the air in a closed space fire decreases because the fire is consuming so much oxygen. The second problem is that oftentimes in car accidents, when things are on fire, they release chemicals into the air that can injure the lungs directly. And lastly, the heat from the smoke and the heat of the environment can cause direct thermal damage to the lungs themselves.
The car doesn't burn for no reason except in the movies. Here, Laura and her son were particularly unlucky. The bus hit the back of the car, and that's where the fuel tank's located. It ripped the fuel tank open. Fuel and air and a source of heat, probably from the bus, the engine, the brakes, something like that, caused the fire. This chain of events coming together left Laura and Jason with little chance of survival.
As the weeks go by, the chances of finding the suspect vehicle begin to rapidly decline. Don and Marty exhaust every angle of the investigation, going over the crash scene reconstruction, looking for anything that they might have missed. But the case is also widely covered by the media, and that's how police get the break they've been hoping for, an anonymous tip.
Yeah, hi, Marty. There was a lot of publicity on TV about the accident because of the fire, and it was not too long after that the police department received a call from an anonymous person saying that they believed that the accident was staged, that it was done on purpose, and they knew the people that were doing it.
With all of the roadway evidence, the statements given by Miss Albright and Dave Peterson, and now the tip-off, Don and Marty are certain they're on the right track. But they are about to tackle the hardest part of their job. They must prove who was behind the wheel and that he or she intentionally set up the crash.
We utilize a variety of investigative methods, some with information from insurance companies or other law enforcement agencies. Sometimes we end up having the opportunity to do undercover investigations, and those are obviously very beneficial to us because we can be right there with the suspects and we're getting firsthand information, whether they're making admissions to the person thinking the undercover officer is a friend or a co-criminal, so to speak. It's some of the best kind of evidence we can get.
The investigation leads to Norman Miller, a young man from the area who has been involved in staged accident cases before. Over the course of the next few months, the undercover agent reports back with names, dates, and even a boastful admission from the suspect that he had messed up the accident that killed Laura and Jason. The operation is closing in on Norman Miller, but one key element is missing: the car Miller used to commit his crime.
When I looked at the yellow and black marks on the right front bumper of the motorhome, I measured the height of it and I measured the length of it because I wanted to find a bumper that was the same height and the same distance between the various marks.
This information on the exact dimensions of the bumper becomes critical when the investigation finally leads authorities to the discovery of the suspect vehicle in a remote parking lot. The red car fits perfectly with Peterson's description. Feeling the heat, Norman Miller flees the state, but the police eventually track him down in Arizona. With all the pieces of the puzzle in place, Don Carroll can finally say exactly how this tragic chain of events unfolded. On a sunny afternoon, accident stager Norman Miller spots a motorhome, which he believes has all the makings of a lucrative accident. Moments later, he pulls in front of the motorhome and stops, causing the rear-end collision he hoped for. However, this also causes a collision with two vehicles behind the motorhome, resulting in the death of Laura Smith and her young son, Jason. After months of investigation, Officer Don Carroll accumulates the evidence necessary to bring Miller to trial. The case against Norman Miller is rock solid, and he ultimately acknowledges his role in the accident. He pleads guilty to manslaughter and is sentenced to 11 years in jail for the death of Laura and Jason Smith.
Somebody that slammed on their brakes in front of another car to try to cause a crash is the lowest of the low.
People just do really crazy and stupid things for the sake of a few dollars.
Hit and runs are difficult crimes to solve. We're looking for evidence on the body, off the roadway, and when we find the car, we'll be looking for it there too. Paint chips are a big clue. Stuff off the body and off the road are going to give us clues like DNA and microscopic evidence. You may want to run, you may not be able to hide. Once they find the car, we're going to be able to tie this vehicle to that wreck pretty much every time.
It's Kevin Polensky's 5th birthday, and his entire family has gathered to celebrate at a local restaurant. But just as they're ready to bring out the birthday cake, Nadia, the grandmother, realizes that she has forgotten the candles. She excuses herself and hurries next door to buy a box at the convenience store. But after about 20 minutes, Nadia still hasn't returned. The family begins searching up and down the roadside outside the restaurant, calling Nadia's name. After searching the neighborhood for nearly an hour, it becomes obvious that she's nowhere to be found. All her son Alex can do now is contact the police to report a missing person. Later that afternoon, officers answer a call from a pair of local teenagers who claim to have found a dead body. It's lying on the side of the road a short distance from the restaurant where the Polenskys celebrated earlier that day. Accident investigator Lenny Simpson is immediately called in to head up the investigation.
When I arrived at the scene, saw the body of an elderly lady. Didn't take long at all for the police to link the missing person, Nadia Polensky, with the body that was found at the scene. It was obvious this was not a mugging, it was not an assault. It was a hit and run.
Police catalog more than 100 pieces of evidence at the crash site, including the packet of candles.
Her body was so deformed from injury, you immediately make associations with people you know and with family members you know. So it got very close to the heart.
Nadia's body is found on the other side of the parking lot, several hundred meters away from the restaurant and the convenience store. The family is devastated and can't explain why she would have crossed the road or wandered away.
We don't know if she became confused, disoriented, or what occurred, but she did not go directly back to the restaurant. She attempted to cross the street, and when she crossed the street, that's when she was struck.
After speaking with the family in more detail, Lenny learns that Nadia Polensky suffered from a number of medical conditions, including severe hypertension.
While talking to the family, I questioned them as to whether she had any health problems. They explained that she had had a stroke several years prior, and that she didn't have too much of a problem being disoriented. However, occasionally she did become disoriented.
Especially the elderly suffer from transient ischemic events in their brain where they sort of have a stroke-like situation where they get disoriented and are not sure where they are, and maybe their speech slurs, and maybe that's what happened here.
If in fact Nadia suffered a mini-stroke, this would explain why she wandered off, and it could completely change the circumstances of the crash.
We look at all the information, we look at all the possibilities, and one of the possibilities that we look at is if Mrs. Polensky was possibly down on her knees or even laying down when this vehicle struck her.
It would be very hard for a driver to hit a standing person and not realize it. But unknowingly running over a small body like Nadia's while she's lying down on the ground is a reasonable scenario. These two possibilities would have very different consequences for the driver.
Me and my partner.
Establishing Nadia's position at the moment of impact is crucial. The autopsy results and the evidence on the car that hit her could provide the physical evidence needed to answer many of these questions.
Okay, this is all about injuries. We're looking at this crash for injury patterns. On this particular dummy, what we're gonna see is marks on the back, marks on his buttocks, down the legs. This is gonna indicate that this dummy was standing up, and you can see here with bumper scuffs, hit from behind when the car came through, as opposed to, for example, laying down or sitting in the roadway. You'd have a different set of injuries. And of course, we tied those things to marks on the car. You'd be able to tell which way he was facing, how he was moving, whether he was sitting or standing or even walking or running when he was hit.
I have got measurements. Now I have to find the vehicle to make that comparison with.
While officers begin collecting and documenting the broken car parts, Lenny examines the crash scene itself. And he doesn't have to look very hard to find a lucky lead.
Lucky? The only thing the driver didn't leave is their driver's license. The tire mark itself was an exceptional, unusual piece of physical evidence that helped us solve this case.
Lenny also has a good idea about how the tire marks were made.
Tire mark came from the right front tire of the vehicle. The impact was significant enough that it bent the metal into the tire. The tire then began marking the roadway very shortly after the impact occurred, and this tire mark continued from the impact approximately 2 miles to the driveway and the residence of Mr. Richard Kelly. We served the search warrant on the house, and once we served the search warrant, we opened the garage door, and there was the car. It had the damage that was consistent with damage of a pedestrian impact, and it was also the tire mark leading right to the tire. Right to the tire.
Finding the car moves the investigation into overdrive. Lenny immediately looks for physical evidence on the vehicle, not only to link it to the collision, but also to establish if Nadia was standing or not when she was hit.
We also, under further examination, found clothing fibers that looked very similar to what Mrs. Polinsky was wearing. We also found blood. We found hair. And we found marks on the car that were consistent, again, with a pedestrian being struck.
But despite the preponderance of evidence, locating the car is just a first step. Next, investigators must put a driver behind the wheel.
Just because you have the car doesn't mean the case is closed. What you have to establish now is who was driving the car at the time the impact occurred.
Lenny runs a check on the license and learns that the car belongs to the owner of the house, Richard Kelly. Interrogated about the damage to his car, Kelly admits that he thinks he may have hit a dead animal on the road. The physical evidence is immediately sent to a forensic lab for a complete analysis.
We would do comparisons, DNA comparisons, as well as fiber comparisons, to help us determine that this was, in fact, the vehicle that did the striking.
Then something else catches Lenny's attention that strikes him as suspicious.
The entire front bumper of the car was gone. We didn't see it at the scene. We certainly didn't find it at the house. We didn't know where the bumper was, but it was missing.
The evidence on the scene leaves investigators skeptical of Kelly's story. But given Nadia's medical history, Lenny needs to keep in mind that she may have been lying on the ground or even already dead when the vehicle hit her. Without concrete proof one way or the other, the entire case could ultimately be ruled an unfortunate accident. A birthday celebration turns into a nightmare when the body of 70-year-old Nadia Polinsky is discovered on the side of a road. Accident investigator Lenny Simpson believes he's found the car that hit the grandmother, but he still can't say if she was standing, laying down, or even dead when she was hit. He'll have to wait for the autopsy report to find out. Meanwhile, Lenny must put a driver behind the wheel of the suspected vehicle. He continues to search the inside of Kelly's car for more clues.
We found a cell phone. We also found a receipt from the restaurant. The restaurant receipt that we found inside the car on the console had the restaurant name, it had the date, and it had the time. The time that the credit card was used to pay for the meal.
The credit card belongs to Richard Kelly. This is a very important clue. It places Kelly at a restaurant located only 6 kilometers from the scene just a short time before Nadia was hit.
We went to the restaurant. We had a photograph of Kelly. I was able to talk with the waitress that actually waited on Mr. Kelly. She positively identified him as being the person that she had waited on, that he had had somewhere between 5 and 6 beers to drink in a short period of time. And what we were also able to establish is that he was there with a woman. This woman could have been the last person to see Kelly driving the car before the impact occurred.
Following his instinct, Lenny wonders if maybe Kelly called the mysterious woman before they met at the restaurant.
We subpoenaed the records for the cell phone, and we were able to establish who Mr. Kelly called, what time they called, and what date they called.
The phone record check pays off. Before and after the time of the event, Kelly called the same number many times. This number belongs to Jane Thornton, Kelly's girlfriend.
I expected Jane Thornton was the woman who had lunch with Richard Kelly. And to my surprise, I found out that was not the case at all. She was at home waiting for him to come home to dinner, but he never came home. And when she found out that he was having dinner with another woman, needless to say, she became very upset.
Jane Thornton is now eager to cooperate. She informs police that Kelly did call her that day and told her he may have accidentally hit an animal. This would seem to support the theory that Kelly didn't realize he'd hit Nadia in the first place. But then Jane goes on to reveal that Kelly pleaded with her to drive by the scene and retrieve any missing car parts. This strikes Lenny Simpson as extremely suspicious. The autopsy report now becomes critical. If the evidence shows that Nadia was standing at the time of impact, it will be enough to bring a hit-and-run charge against Richard Kelly.
When you're down on the ground and you're run over, you have very different injuries than if you're standing up and you're struck by a car.
The autopsy report clearly shows Nadia's position at the time of impact. The fractures to her legs were both above the knee, suggesting a standing position at the time she was hit. Her pelvis, ribs, and skull were fractured on the left side, consistent with a collision of this nature and speed. The injuries inflicted by this violent crash are all consistent with the damage on Kelly's vehicle and responsible for Nadia Polensky's untimely death.
The autopsy report proved that she was upright, that she was not bent over, and that when she was struck, she was standing straight. It was a hit and run. It involved a death. The person who struck this woman did not stop. I knew this was going to be my career case.
The next morning, they receive a tip from a concerned neighbor.
We got a report from one of the neighbors that lives on the same street as Richard Kelly. And this neighbor explained that he had found a bumper.
Biological matter, including hair and blood, will be sent to the lab for analysis, but Lenny has no doubt about the results.
Kelly attempted to hide the bumper so that we could not have it as physical evidence. He was trying to prevent his arrest.
After a week of investigative work, Detective Lenny Simpson can finally replay the events that led to Nadia Polensky's untimely death. On that fateful afternoon, Kelly heads back to work after having lunch and several beers at a nearby restaurant. As the elderly Nadia Polensky crosses the road, Kelly slams into her, sending her body flying through the air and landing on a pile of trash by the street corner. But rather than assist the injured woman or call the authorities, Kelly drives away. Several hours later, he returns to the scene, and rather than check on his victim, he hides evidence in an attempt to cover his tracks. The autopsy report shows that Nadia Polensky died as a result of several head and spinal cord injuries. Richard Kelly is finally found guilty of a hit-and-run accident resulting in a fatal injury. He was sentenced to 5 years in jail.
It became an obsession, and that was probably because of the family. They had lost someone who was near and dear to them, and to die such a violent death was just not fair. So I felt compelled. I had to absolutely do the best I could ever do to resolve and solve this case.
Accident investigators are used to dealing with bloody scenes, dead bodies all the time. But there's nothing like investigating the death of a fellow officer. It's like investigating the death of a family member. And there's no one that can do that job but the accident investigator himself.
At the end of a long day, Officer Marty Keene is patrolling a quiet neighborhood waiting for his shift to end. Everything seems to be going smoothly when suddenly, something catches his eye in the rearview mirror. He swings a quick U-turn and drives back in the direction he came from. As it turns out, Officer Keene has stumbled onto a major car accident involving 2 vehicles, one of which has caught fire. He can't wait for emergency personnel to arrive. The burning vehicle could explode at any minute, and he must get the driver out fast. As medics arrive on the scene, the passenger from the other car staggers out into the street, but the driver is not responding.
Yo, we got help here.
Officer Keene is transported to the hospital along with the crash victims. However, for driver Fred Niedermeyer, it's too late. He's pronounced dead at the scene.
Responding to the scene of a two-car accident, my dispatcher advised me that my best friend Marty tried to save one of the drivers in the accident when the vehicle caught on fire, and he suffered smoke inhalation and had to be transported to the hospital himself. Marty Keene, he's my best friend. I've known him for about 8 years. He's the one that got me into doing the accident investigation.
In fires, there are two things that happen. You obviously can have direct thermal injuries where your actual tissues are burned up. But what most people die of in fires is smoke inhalation. And there's sort of two things that are going on. One is that you can breathe in smoke, which, depending on what's burning, can have toxic chemicals in it. And the second thing that happens is fire's hot. And so what you can be breathing in is very, very hot air. And what that can do, and often how people die in, say, flash fires or very, very hot fires, is they take in one breathful of hot air and their larynx swells shut. So they can't get any more air in, and that's how they die.
As he arrives at the scene, Officer Jones receives more alarming news about the crash.
It turned out that the driver of one of the cars was another one of our police officers named Tommy Erickson. Despite my emotional feelings in this, I knew I had to continue with this investigation and complete it. With Marty in the hospital, there was no one left. We were the only two accident investigators.
Officer Jones is immediately faced with several critical questions. Were drugs or alcohol involved? Could this event have been caused by a mechanical failure? Or was one of the drivers at fault? All of these answers will be hard to come by and could have major ramifications for the drivers and their families.
I've responded to many accidents before, many serious accidents, but I've never actually had one involving a coworker or even my best friend at this point.
The first thing Officer Jones notices is that both vehicles are in the same lane. Sheriff Erickson's car is sitting on the curb, while the other vehicle has come to rest in the middle of the lane, facing in the wrong direction.
When I looked at Tommy's car, it was up against the curb. The front end was smashed on it, and it looked like some fire damage to the front end. I looked over to my left, and I saw this small black car on the wrong side of the road in the lane it looked like Tommy was traveling in. And my first impression, it was a head-on collision.
But as Officer Jones examines the stretch of roadway behind Sheriff Erickson's car, he observes some peculiar skid marks that are not consistent with a head-to-head crash.
Normally in a situation like this, when it is a true head-on collision, the marks would just be straight. They wouldn't be on an angle like they were on.
Then Robert notices something else unusual. While Tommy's car has left strange angled skid marks, he can't find any signs of braking from the other vehicle at all. This is very puzzling. Why on earth would Niedermeyer just plow straight into Erickson's car head-on? Tragically, Robert will never have the opportunity to ask his colleague Tommy Erickson about the crash. The sheriff is pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital.
When the officer told me that Tommy had died, I was devastated, but I wasn't totally surprised. After the examination of the car, it was difficult for me to understand how anybody could have survived the impact that he suffered on the steering wheel.
As Officer Jones crawls around the scene looking for physical evidence, he discovers tiny gouge marks in the roadway.
Anytime there is a severe impact, you usually have gouge marks because the front end of a car will go down and will actually impact the surface, and it'll cause it to dig in and cause these gouge marks. And it generally tells you the direction the car was coming from or the direction the car was at the time of the impact.
But the gouge marks that Robert sees here are not making sense. From what he can tell, The car that made these gouge marks could not possibly have been involved in a head-to-head crash.
The undercarriage of this car had drug the asphalt in a way that was not consistent with a head-on collision. I thought this was very important to this investigation.
The positions of the cars tell Robert that it was a head-on collision, but the minimal brake marks and the gouges in the road suggest otherwise. Robert hopes that the vehicle inspection will shed some light on this physical evidence and the possibility of mechanical failure. But for now, Robert has immediate concerns. He heads to the hospital to check on his partner and the one surviving victim. After a troubling day with many unanswered questions, he's finally given some good news. His partner, Officer Marty Keene, is still unconscious, but recovering from his injuries in intensive care. Expecting to find the one surviving passenger in critical condition, Officer Jones is amazed to see him sleeping peacefully. His name is Arthur Curtis, and his chart notes that he has only suffered one minor injury, a broken nose.
I was a little surprised when I found out that Arthur had just had a broken nose. Seeing how both drivers had died in this collision, something just didn't seem right to me.
The interview with Arthur Curtis provides more clues.
I could smell alcohol on his breath. I asked him if Fred Niedermeyer had been drinking also. And Curtis told me that they had both come from a bar right down the street from where the accident happened. The toxicology report indicated that Fred Niedermeyer had consumed quite a bit of alcohol. His blood alcohol level was a 0.18, which is considerably over the legal limit.
The blood alcohol content could explain the lack of brake marks from Niedermeyer's car. Perhaps he was just too drunk to react to the oncoming vehicle. It may also shed some light as to why Niedermeyer ended up in Sheriff Erickson's lane. But it still doesn't explain why the passenger, Arthur Curtis, only suffered a minor injury, or why Erickson reacted to the oncoming car so late.
It appears that Tommy just locked the brakes up and tried to turn away from it just right at the last minute, like he never saw it coming. I had a hard time trying to figure that out.
Next, Officer Jones gets Fred Niedermeyer's autopsy results. It notes that Niedermeyer was not wearing his seatbelt, leaving his body unprotected against the violent shock of the crash, resulting in a lacerated aorta.
Car A hits Car B, and all that force from Car A gets transferred to person in Car B. The bodies inside the car keep moving and hit something inside the car, and then the organs inside the bodies keep moving and hit something inside the body. So it's boom, boom, boom.
Well, that crash was only at 35. Imagine if it was a lot faster, like Sheriff Erickson's. In every crash, there are 3 collisions. The first one's between the car parts. The next one is bodies striking structures inside the cars, like the steering wheel and the dash. The last one is where body parts strike internal body parts, like the ribs. Your heart and your lungs striking the ribs can cause blunt force trauma. That can lead to internal bleeding, and that's what killed Sheriff Erickson.
An off-duty sheriff is involved in a deadly car crash that kills him and another driver. The resting position of the car suggests that it was a head-on collision. But the rest of the physical evidence says otherwise, creating a real mystery for the investigator. As a first step, Officer Jones needs to run a complete mechanical check on the vehicles and document the damage from the crash.
I'm driving over to the garage now to do the vehicle autopsies on the 2 vehicles involved in that crash. Right now, the best evidence I have are the 3 gouge marks in the road. I want to look underneath that vehicle and find out what caused those gouge marks.
The brakes and operating systems check out okay, so mechanical failure is ruled out. But the question remains, why would 2 cars collide head-on with virtually no attempt to avoid each other? Officer Jones's next job is to painstakingly match the marks on the road with the cars and parts that caused them. This giant jigsaw puzzle should give him a fairly accurate sense of the crash dynamics. While inspecting the undercarriage of Fred Niedermeyer's car, he finds his first important piece of the puzzle.
What I discovered is the marks right here in the suspension are what caused the gouge marks. There's actually pieces of asphalt still on the metal components underneath this car. When I looked at the gouge marks again and saw the angle they were coming on, I was able to determine that Fred Niedermeyer's car was actually coming on an angle and not directly head on.
It's a blue guy there, right there.
This is a major breakthrough in the case. With Niedermeyer's angled gouge marks and the offset skid marks from Erickson's car, Robert now has a clear idea of where the cars were at the time of the impact.
It appeared to me that Fred Niedermeyer was actually making a left turn, or making a long sweeping turn into a driveway access, and he turned right in the path of Tommy. That explains to me why Tommy never reacted to this crash.
The force generated in a head-on collision would have been so violent that no one would likely have survived the crash. This left turn finding explains why the passenger in Niedermeyer's car wasn't more severely injured. The impact was absorbed primarily on the driver's side, leaving the passenger side mostly free of this deadly force.
The evidence left by the skid marks indicate that Tommy actually swerved to the right just before the collision.
This discovery puts Niedermeyer clearly at fault. But one mystery still remains. If it was a left-turn collision, how did Niedermeyer's car end up in the opposite lane facing Erickson, creating the illusion of a head-on crash?
Tommy's car was actually 10 miles an hour faster and 1,000 pounds more than Fred's car. And that explains why Fred's car went so far backwards and wound up in the lane that Tommy was originally driving.
It was this weight and speed disparity and the resulting backwards movement that made the crash look like a head-on collision. The pieces are all coming together for Officer Jones. This new theory explains the victim's injury patterns and the absence of roadway evidence, as neither driver had much time to react to the other's vehicle. With the final piece of the puzzle in place, Officer Jones can now replay the events that led to this unfortunate tragedy. Fred Niedermeyer and Arthur Curtis spend the afternoon drinking beers at a local bar.
Wow, cut their heads off.
Soon after leaving, Niedermeyer slows down to make a left turn but fails to check for oncoming traffic. The impact of the collision lifts Niedermeyer's car off the ground, pushes it backward, causing it to land in the center of the lane facing in the wrong direction. The pieces all fit together for Officer Robert Jones, but the solution only came after a lengthy and emotionally draining investigation. Thankfully, Marty Keene eventually makes a full recovery, but sadly, both officers' thoughts are with the relatives of Sheriff Erickson and Fred Niedermeyer. No criminal charges were filed in this case.
This accident was an emotional struggle for me because a coworker was killed in the accident. A friend of mine was injured in the accident. Once I completed my investigation, I was relieved to find out that Tommy wasn't at fault in any way, shape, or form in this accident.
This was a difficult case for Robert on a number of levels, professionally and emotionally. Don't be fooled by that appearance of callousness and coolness the accident investigators show. Deep down, remember, they're human beings as well. They care about getting that guy off the road that deserves to be off the road because they drive as well and so do their families. There's no doubt about it that riding a bike requires a different skill set than driving a car and greater concentration. One of the things that Jeff's investigation reminds us is that riders have to be responsible for their own safety and their safety equipment. This guy made a series of mistakes, but sometimes it's only one mistake that could end a life. There are two types of things going on out there, crashes and accidents. Accidents can't be avoided. They're unintentional events. No matter how many times you inspect the truck, you do the maintenance, do all the things you're supposed to do on that truck, sometimes something happens that you just can't anticipate. So how do we avoid crashes? We give those drivers some room. We give them space to stop. We don't cut them off. They're 80,000 pounds running down the road. You're about 2,000, 3,000 pounds. Who's going to win that battle? Give them some space, give them time to react. We'll all go home safely.